what often gets overlooked is how our core aspect of what we eat can accelerate aging. So what did you find out, and what's important to talk about when it comes to the topic of aging and longevity and glucose?
Yeah. So every time our glucose levels spike, all the glucose floating around is creating this process called glycation. And literally, glycation is aging. So when you put a chicken in the oven and it goes brown, it's being glycated. And the faster we glycate, the faster we age, the faster our organs deteriorate, and the faster we die. With every glucose spike, we're aging our body. And if you take two people, both 70 years old, let's say, one had X million glucose spikes in their life, and the other one had half those glucose spikes, the person who had half those glucose spikes is going to look way younger and is going to be way younger internally. So every day, the way you're eating and its impact on your glucose levels is dictating how quickly you're aging. It's insane. Aging internally, aging externally, as I mentioned, the wrinkles, of course. And there's a very well-known test of people who have diabetes. It's the HbA1c test, and it measures how much glycation was happening in your body for the past 3 months. And literally what it's measuring is how many red blood cell proteins have been glycated by glucose. It's measuring how quickly you're cooking on the inside. And so the higher HbA1c, the faster you're cooking, the faster you're aging. So it's very powerful to revisit a little bit the way you're eating and apply the easy glucose hacks that I share, because long term, you're going to see the benefits and you're not going to age as quickly. And honestly, when I found this out, I was really starstruck because I didn't realize this impact on aging. I understood the mechanisms behind hunger and cravings and diabetes, etc., but this really blew my mind. And I really wanted people to know, because it's really important. We're always looking for the anti-aging pill, but actually food is a really powerful place to start. And the second one is exercise. I mean, exercise is the most powerful anti-aging drug. And if they could put it in a pill, it would be the miracle pill. So unfortunately, a lot of times, anti-aging is about stuff that is lifestyle related, to be honest. And Peter Attia actually posted this nice post on Instagram, I think it was yesterday or the day before, showing this study that showed exactly that if you look at exercise, it's one of the most powerful anti-aging drugs you can take.
One of the most powerful experiences I had from wearing a continuous glucose monitor, is that it made me more accountable to my movement and my exercise. I would notice the weeks that I didn't hit my sort of goal of like 3 sort of high intensity workouts. Again, that's my goal. That's not everybody else's goal. I wanted to hit at least 3 high intensity workouts. I was eating the same basic diet, but my average glucose was so much higher when I didn't have those minimum workouts that I had. 30 minutes, 3 times a week, high intensity workouts with the trainer that I work out with on Zoom. So that's another reason why that, again, if you can afford it, I do think that experimenting at least for 1 month with the glucose monitor is helpful, because you start to see how all these things are connected. What was your relationship with movement and exercise? And did it change as you started to go deeper into this category of glucose?
When I first put on a glucose monitor, one thing that shocked me is that sometimes when I exercised, I actually saw a glucose spike during the workout. And I was like, what's happening? Isn't this bad? Am I supposed to avoid glucose spikes? So is exercise bad? So I did the research. And in fact, actually, sometimes when you're exercising, your body will release glucose from the liver to fuel your muscles, because your muscles need glucose to contract, to make energy and help you lift all the heavy weights and stuff. And so that spike you're seeing is actually your body releasing stored glucose. And in that case, even though the spike has the consequences I mentioned previously, the negative consequences, overall, exercising helps your body fight these. It helps your body reduce inflammation, reduce the quickness of aging, and reduce insulin release. So overall, the first thing I learned is that overall, even if you see a spike while you're exercising, it's actually overall good for your body. Then second, I realized that a very easy thing you could do after you eat something to reduce the glucose spike of the meal was actually to use your muscles for a little bit. So your muscles need energy to contract, and the fastest way they get energy is from the glucose in your bloodstream. So if you've just had a meal that's creating a big glucose spike, what you can do is just use your muscles for 10 minutes. And this can be doing the laundry, going for a walk with your dog, dancing to your favorite song, like going up and down the stairs at the office, whatever. If you do this, as the glucose is rushing into your bloodstream from your digestive system, your muscles are going to uptake it. They're going to soak it up like they're going to soak it up, and they're going to reduce the glucose spike. So you get a much smaller glucose spike from the same meal that you just ate. And it's pretty cool because oftentimes, especially after dinner, we tend to just kind of sit there. But if we just get up and move a little bit, it has a big impact on our physical and mental health. And for me, it has a huge impact on how tired I feel after eating. If instead of just sitting there, I go even for a 10-minute walk, I don't have that crash anymore because I'm helping my body not experience the glucose roller coaster. I'm much steadier in how I feel for the rest of the day.
Growing up, my grandparents were religious about after dinner, we'd all go on a walk around the neighborhood. And I thought it was the
Yeah,
weirdest thing. You know, you're walking around with your entire family around the neighborhood. And it was a
that's
beautiful thing
great.
looking back
Yeah,
at that. And there was just something intrinsically that they knew. It was just built in part of it. They didn't have the words, they didn't know about the studies, but it was something intrinsically they knew that this would end up helping everybody feel better. And even my grandmother one time told me on my dad's side that it'll help you sleep better too. And
mm,
again, I didn't know, is this like just like, home remedies, old wives' tales, other stuff. But I think that she was onto something. She was onto something, and she knew that if we can bring our blood sugar back in balance, it impacts our sleep. And you've written about this a little bit.
yeah. And actually, Drew, so many times there are these cultural traditions that have been passed on for generations and generations, and they don't understand the underlying mechanism. But now, with our current technology, we're able to see the impact on glucose. So, some other examples are, for example, in countries like Iran, they drink a lot of apple cider vinegar and they make it themselves and they drink it all the time, every day. There is also this tradition of starting the meal with vegetables. Like in France, we start meals traditionally with crudités, which are raw vegetables. In other countries, it's like bunches of herbs by the bunch. In Italy, it's antipasti, which is vegetable based. And so it's very interesting to me to see how actually culturally we've had a lot of things right for a very long time. But now it's cool that with the data and with the science, we're able to understand why exactly it works. But your grandmother was totally right.
Yeah. How does getting good quality sleep play into this conversation?
So, the biggest impact I see, the biggest relationship between sleep and glucose is, for one, if you go to sleep with a big glucose spike happening in your body, if you go to bed in that state, you're going to wake up the next day not well rested. I mean, if your glucose levels were doing a roller coaster throughout the night because you had a very heavy glucose spiking meal for dinner, you're going to wake up feeling a little hungover, to be honest, from those glucose spikes. And unfortunately, when we wake up feeling tired, our body for that day is not going to be as good as usual in terms of processing glucose coming in. So the same food will create a bigger spike. I have this test that I love showing. It's cappuccino after I've slept well versus cappuccino when I'm super tired. And when I'm super tired, the cappuccino creates a spike, even though when I'm rested, it's like totally steady. Because your body, you know, like we even feel it in our brain, but when we're tired, systems just don't run as smoothly and our body is just not as effective as usual in helping dispose of glucose spikes. So what I want to say is that when you're tired, it's even more important to use the glucose hacks because you're going to be at a disadvantage. The same foods you usually eat are going to be creating bigger glucose spikes and bigger crashes and more likelihood of cravings. So if you wake up and you're tired, have a savory breakfast. Try to avoid anything sweet in the morning because as a result, your glucose after your breakfast will be steadier and you won't start the cravings roller coaster. If you have something sweet, I know it's very tempting because when we're tired, we just feel like, oh, sugar's going to give me energy. Actually, sugar's not going to give you energy. Sugar's going to overwhelm your mitochondria. Your mitochondria are going to shut down and are not going to be able to give you the energy you need. we feel that sugar gives us energy because it makes us feel pleasure in our brain. But that's not the same thing as actually your body having energy. Another good
Mm.
one to come back to the muscles. If you wake up feeling tired, do 5 minutes of movement in the morning. Maybe you do like 50 jumping jacks or whatever you like doing. I don't know, dance to a few songs. This will help your muscles wake up and become more sensitive to glucose coming through into your bloodstream. And therefore, they'll be better at soaking it up whenever it comes through during the day.
Powerful. All simple
Yeah.
reminders, but like very powerful when we start to stack them together. And now you can
Hmm.
see that even though it starts to seem like a lot, it's really not because they're all interlinked. And when you feel amazing, it's just like, of course I'm going to do this. This is like automatic. It's
And
easy.
we're not talking about removing entire food groups from your diet. It's really additive stuff, which is what I love so much about this philosophy. We're not taking away anything. We're just adding fun, easy, cool habits that have a huge impact on how you're going to feel and your happiness levels. I mean, I don't think everybody wakes up in the morning feeling amazing. And if you don't wake up in the morning feeling amazing, you need this information because it's going to help you get there. That was my experience. So I know it for a fact, but it's really important. And at the beginning of the podcast, you said something about zeitgeist. And I really hope that all these hacks will just become part of our culture and everybody will just know about this. That it will just be like your grandmother knew to walk after dinner, that we're all going to know to start our meals with a vegetable starter, to have some vinegar, to eat food in the right order, and everything else I share. That's my hope.
That's my hope as well. And you're a major
Mm,
contributor to that. I want to run through, if you have a little bit more time, a few
of
other
course.
categories that people start to unpack and maybe rethink a little bit in how they're approaching it when they understand the framework of how glucose relates to how they feel. So
Mm,
you mentioned cappuccino a little earlier. Um, and there's this principle inside the book we've talked about a little bit before, flatten your breakfast. Now,
yeah.
even a lot of people that know that we don't want to eat dessert for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and especially breakfast, very sugary oatmeals, yogurts, other things like that with a lot of added sugar, big glasses of orange juice and things like that. We know we want to minimize that or maybe avoid that as a way to start the day. Still, there's a lot of people that are having their sweetened caffeinated beverage in the morning.
Yeah.
What have been some things that you've seen of how we can still enjoy our caffeine, maybe still enjoy some of the milk of our choice, but avoid that heavy, intense spike that often comes from having a very highly sweetened liquid beverage first thing in the morning?
So there are a few things you can do. First, you can switch your liquid beverage and not have the sweet liquid beverage anymore. So if we're talking like a tall vanilla frappuccino, yada yada, change it to something that is just coffee and milk or coffee and cream. So switch to doing things like lattes, cappuccinos, make your own cool little blended coffee drink in the morning that doesn't include sugar. Because fundamentally, the the shape of your breakfast curve is going to impact so severely the rest of your day. It is incredible. It's very important to get this right because it's completely going to change how you feel for the rest of the day. And my philosophy for breakfast is sugars and starches at breakfast should be for taste only, for pleasure only. You should build your breakfast around protein and fat and fiber, and that's your real breakfast. And then you can have a breakfast dessert. So you can have the tall vanilla frappuccino thing, or you can have some chocolate if you really want it for breakfast dessert. But do not break the fast with anything that creates a big glucose spike. Because when we're fasted, our body is just ready and is incredibly sensitive to anything we give it. So that vanilla frappuccino, it's going to create a humongous spike in your system. A lot of inflammation, a lot of aging, a lot of weight gain, a lot of dysregulation of all of your hormones. You need to help your body not be so affected by these things. And the way to do it is to first have a savory breakfast built around protein, fat, and fiber. And then, if you really want it, to have the breakfast dessert.
And I think to add to that, because a lot of my audience is like, well, I don't go to Starbucks. I don't have that Frappuccino that's there, but they get that oat milk latte and
Ah,
and they get that sweetened almond milk barista version of almond milk that is has a lot of
Yes.
emulsifiers and other things inside of it, but a lot of sugar inside of it as well. So even switching to an unsweetened
Unsweetened.
plant-based
Yes.
milk. So many people are drinking plant-based milks, and that category is taken off, and I'm one of those individuals. But really reaching for the one that doesn't have sugar, because we know now, after doing many episodes with different experts that are out there, liquid sugar in particular is quite harmful for us, especially first thing in the morning if we're doing it every single day. And
Yes.
coffee and coffee rituals is typically something that people do every single day.
And what you can do when you go, if you go to the coffee shop, for example, ask to just see the ingredients on their nut milk. So I usually do almond milk or whole milk. Have a look on the pack, because if it says just 100% almonds, you're fine. But if it says almonds and cane sugar, then you don't want to be drinking that. But they have a lot of unsweetened versions of nut milk. I'm a big whole milk person, which is, fine for your glucose levels. And it's better than skim milk, as you mentioned, because while whole milk and skim milk have the same amount of naturally occurring sugars in them, whole milk also has fat. And the fat in the whole milk is literally putting clothes on the milk sugar, preventing it from creating too much of a spike. That's why it's important to have the whole milk version, the whole versions of things, because they come naturally with these clothes on. A little note on oat milk. So oat is a starch. Oat turns to glucose as we digest it. Oat milk is very, very high in glucose because it's made from a starch. It's not made from a nut and doesn't come from a cow or something like that. So naturally, it actually creates a very big spike. Now, it seems to depend on the type of oat milk, but generally you see a pretty big spike when you have an oat milk based coffee drink. So here's the solution, because I know people love oat milk and they don't want to give it up. So the solution for your oat milk spike is don't have it on an empty stomach. So if you just want to not have a big breakfast in the morning, have like 20 almonds and then have your oat milk. And then go for a little walk. Don't just grab the oat milk first thing and then sit for 3 hours. Help your body process it. Help your body not have all these consequences. Better yet, have it after a savory breakfast. Have it as your breakfast dessert. Or have it in the afternoon, for example, I don't know, it's kind of weird to have coffee after lunch, but whatever. If this floats your boat, you can do it like that too. Have it after lunch, after you've eaten lunch and the food in your lunch in the right order, and before you go up and down the stairs. You could also do vinegar before your oat milk latte if you so wished to. That would also work. There's lots of things you can do. But if you don't really care for oat milk, switch. Do whole milk, do almond milk. I mean, nothing's perfect, but in terms of your glucose levels, oat milk is not the best choice.
Yeah, it's really tough. I will say anecdotally from the friends that I've gifted glucose monitors to and the family members, generally they all have, like, compared to the standard American diet or the processed, world diet that's out there, they generally are headed way more in the right direction. But across the board, usually, I've seen like 8 out of 10, their biggest food that gets reported back when they get their weekly emails, if they're using something like Levels or whatever app they're using, or if they're just taking notes themselves, the biggest thing that is the spike for them often ends up being that oat milk latte.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
again, because we traditionally have it first thing in the morning, we have it on an empty stomach. People often don't even drink water before they reach for their coffee. So be careful. Oats, there's a lot of glyphosate contamination, other things. It's just hard to really make it work. But if you do need to, Jessie just gave you a few ways where you can try, but then get a glucose monitor to actually see if it ends up working. Jessie, what about the category of alcohol? How do we think about
Mm.
alcohol? Do you drink alcohol yourself? And I know there's a few layers to alcohol. We know that alcohol isn't a health food, so to speak, right? And that there are links to a lot of different conditions that are out there. Um, but a lot of people do enjoy
Mhm.
alcohol socially. I'm one of those individuals. What have we seen when it comes to the topic of glucose and alcohol? And any kind of caveats that you would add to that conversation around alcohol?
Mm. So I would just start off by saying that there's no health benefits to drinking alcohol. It's not something that's good for your body. It's difficult for your liver to process. And so when you do drink alcohol, think about it this way. Think, okay, I'm already giving alcohol to my body to process. Let's avoid, on top of that, giving it a glucose spike, because then it has to deal with the alcohol and the glucose spike. And that's just a lot for your liver to handle. So here are the things that you can drink if you're drinking alcohol that do not give a glucose spike. So any wine is fine, apart from the very, very sweet wines that have a lot of leftover sugar from fermentation, but any regular white or red wine that you would order normally is fine. Sparkling wine is also okay, champagne, etc. And then, hard alcohols are also fine from a glucose perspective. However, the real kicker here is the mixers. So if you're having gin, for example, there's a massive difference between a gin tonic and a gin soda. A gin tonic contains extra sugar in the tonic. A gin soda doesn't. So when you're mixing hard alcohols with other things, try to think, okay, what's not going to be too sweet? So the go-to that everybody likes and enjoys is soda water with lime or lemon. That's a really easy one, to be honest. But then if you go for Coca-Cola, if you go for fruit juices, all of that is going to create a glucose spike. So what you can do is use your muscles, dance. Usually when we drink alcohol, we like to dance. So highly encourage dancing after consuming a cocktail that has a lot of sugar in it. That's a good one. But yeah, wine is fine. Beer depends on the beer. There are a bunch of low carb beers now that exist. To be honest, I'm not a very big beer drinker, so I don't know much about them. But all in all, also when we drink alcohol, we know that it's for pleasure and not for health. So it might be one of those cases where you just kind of drink whatever you like.
And other thing, connecting it back to the beginning part of the conversation, is that I've noticed over the years, I'm turning 40 this year, is that as I've cleaned up my diet, one, I need to drink way less to feel any sort of, buzz or things like that. Number two, because you are so sensitive and you so enjoy, your baseline is health and you feel so good when you wake up first thing in the morning, when you've cleaned up your diet and balanced your blood sugar, you actually naturally start cutting down on these things that even if they don't spike your blood glucose like wine does, it does have other detrimental challenges that are there, especially if you drink a lot of it. And you start to get addicted to feeling really good. So you start to wind down and cut down. So in the past, it used to be, I never was a big alcohol drinker to begin with. I didn't even really start drinking wine until I was in my mid 20s. And whenever I would have it, I'd say, okay, maybe a glass or two, and it'd be a couple times a month. Now, I still am on about the couple times a month. If I'm out socially, I just went out with a friend, with my wife, and he invited us to his restaurant here in LA called The Tasting Kitchen, my buddy Mark. And they had a really incredible bottle of this limited vineyard wine that his wine connoisseur went to Italy and goes and finds the greatest places. It was like, you guys got to try this. And I was like, you know what? I'm with friends. I would love to try it. And I was really worried. The wine tasted great, but I naturally saw myself not drinking as much. I don't even finish the whole glass sometimes now, because I still enjoy it. I like the taste of it. I like the romance of it. I like the feeling of it, but I don't even need to finish it to feel good or to feel anything. So I've just naturally cut down the amount of alcohol that's there. We also did a big episode with Dr. Richard Johnson, who's one of the world's experts in uric acid. And he wanted to remind our audience that, sure, wine and certain alcohols don't spike glucose, but there's a mechanism where they can actually cause your body to produce its own fructose through uric acid, which has other downstream consequences. So for all my friends that are posting on Instagram after drinking that glass of wine or three or whatever, saying, "Oh my gosh, I love wine. It doesn't spike my glucose," there's a few caveats that are there to be aware.
Yes. And actually, I think these caveats are very, very important, because if you wear a glucose monitor without too much context, you can start drawing wrong conclusions. You can think that, for example, alcohol is good for me because it doesn't spike my glucose levels, or eating something incredibly fatty is good for me because it doesn't spike my glucose levels, because if you put enough fat on something, it'll keep your glucose levels steady, but it won't be good for you. So I think context is very important. Education is very important. I hope that anybody out there who wears a glucose monitor or is thinking about it will also consider going through my book at first, because I go into all these details. And so it really helps you interpret the data in a way that is more informed. Because when I first started wearing a glucose monitor, as I mentioned, I was like, is exercise bad for me? And wine is good for me? Like, I don't understand. So it's complicated. Glucose is not everything. Glucose is a really powerful lever to start with, but it is not everything. You also have to think about other stuff, relationships, medical care, sleep, happiness, stress. But in my experience, if you get your glucose levels under control, as you just said, all these other things start falling into place. You don't actually want to drink that much anymore because you wake up in the morning feeling really good and you don't want to compromise that anymore. I totally relate to that, Drew. Like in the morning, I feel so good that I think twice about, having a lot to drink because I don't want to wake up not feeling well. I love feeling good. And I was praying to feel good for so many years that now that I have this, what feels like incredible wealth of happiness, I don't want to give it up.
There's a section in the book where you say a day in the life of a glucose goddess. Walk us through that. We've teased a little bit throughout the interview of different ways to go about it, but people are always looking to examples, and that example helps them visualize like, wow, I could do this too. So walk us through the day on the life of a glucose goddess. And by the way, do you have a term for the men that want to identify inside of your community? Is it a glucose homie, a glucose bro? Like, what do you call
It's a
what do the guys
glucose god.
say?
So we have
god?
glucose goddesses, glucose gods, and non-binary glucose royalty.
I'm going to start going on Instagram and calling myself a glucose god, and let's see how fast it takes for me to get canceled.
Oh, come on. No. But the point is everybody can be a glucose god, goddess, non-binary, god-like thing. I think it's cool to think about, how do you put all these in practice? So in the book, as you said, at the end, I sort of go through typical days and situations. And of course, there's many more examples throughout the book of how to incorporate the hacks into your life. But I took a day of my own life and I just actually wrote it out. So this is the day. So I wake up, savory breakfast at home. Let's say like some scrambled eggs, some hummus, some sea salt, maybe like a few pickled cauliflowers from my fridge. And I've started treating breakfast just as a normal meal. And as a result, I feel amazing. I don't have hunger at 11 a.m. and my energy is super steady. Then I would probably add to that a whole milk cappuccino. And then I would go to work or wherever I'm going. And I try to avoid snacking too much in the morning because one, I'm not hungry, and two, it deregulates my glucose levels. So maybe a green tea. But then what often happens to me, Drew, is that as I'm walking around, I often see a very tasty looking pastry. I just have a radar for like really good chocolate based things in my vicinity. So what I would often do is I would see a really amazing looking cookie or slice of cake and I would buy it, but I would keep it for dessert after lunch. So,
what's interesting about that is that just even buying it, there's a dopamine reward, right?
Yeah.
But then we can practice that delayed gratification and save it for later. Because there's part of us that feels, again, that little kid inside of us that if I don't do it now, I'm never going to get it. Yeah. And a lot of people have that. It's okay to admit that, you might be one of those individuals that do. I didn't even think about that, but this is something that I'll find myself doing sometimes is I'll buy it and just knowing that I have it, whether or not I eat it later on or not, is something that, makes me feel good. But anyways, passing it back to you to walk through the
next time you do that, send me a photo and I'll be like, yes, nice one. I just bought some cake. So then for lunch, usually at lunch, I don't really crave having any carbs, any starches. So I usually have like a big salad. Big salad with a bunch of olive oil, maybe some fish and some feta, spinach, nuts. And then I'll have the cake that I bought or the cookie that I bought. And then I will go for a walk after lunch, 100%. And then in the evening, let's say I'm having friends over, for example, I'll serve, while people are arriving, I'll serve a big plate of vegetables or crudité, or like, maybe some guac with some carrots and some cucumbers, something that people can eat while they're waiting for the meal that isn't bread. And as a result, they're going to be lining their stomach and their intestine with this really lovely, helpful mesh. And then for dinner, I'll serve something like some fish and some vegetables and then some starches. I love starches in the evening. They just make me feel really cozy and nice and warm. So whether it's potatoes or pasta or rice, I know to eat the starches after the veggies, the proteins, and the fats. And by now, my friends also know to do this. And then a dessert, let's say maybe like some strawberries and some clotted cream, or like maybe some pastries I made, something like that. And then I'll take all my friends and I'll go for a walk with them around the block, as your grandmother does. Because that way, when everybody comes back, they actually have energy and they want to help me clean up the house. It's a trick. Very good trick. So that's a sample day, but obviously it changes every day. And some days, Drew, I don't feel like doing the hacks and I don't do them, and that's totally fine. But most of the days they're so easy and fun that they've just become part of my life and part of the lives of hundreds and thousands of people. And I hope soon in the lives of everybody listening. For a long time, we thought only people with diabetes should care about their glucose levels. That was the belief that was super prevalent. And over the past few years, thanks to amazing scientists across the world, we've actually discovered that's not the case. We need to all care. And as we care and we put in place some easy hacks to manage it, our life really transforms.
Huge, huge. There's so many people that are diabetic that are out there. I don't have the statistics worldwide.
1 billion people in the world have either prediabetes or type 2 diabetes.
Yeah. And pre-diabetes. And now really through the paying attention of glucose, continuous glucose monitors, the work of people like yourself, people are also starting to realize that they fall into this sort of pre-diabetes category. Like you're just before the pre-diabetes and you're on your way. And, this isn't just about diagnoses, right? Pre-diabetes, more doctors are starting to become aware of that. And diabetes, of course, a lot of people know about that, but it's also about the symptoms of not paying attention to your glucose and how sugar impacts the body. What are some of the common symptoms you see out there when people are completely out of whack and they're riding the roller coaster of the up and downs of glucose?
I call this being a high functioning glucose roller coaster person. It's like you're going up and down, up and down, up and down, and you think you're okay, but you're actually having all these common symptoms like cravings. So wanting sweet foods several times throughout the day, being hungry a couple hours after every meal, feeling like you have really low energy and you need coffee to keep going. So those are the most common symptoms. And in a high functioning glucose roller coaster person, you can kind of sort of deal with them with caffeine, with eating sugary foods every couple of hours. And then you believe, that's just who you are. You're just somebody who's tired, or you're just somebody who eats all the time. Actually, what's going on is you're trying to manage this glucose roller coaster happening within that's causing these symptoms. And if you gently stop the roller coaster, all of a sudden you discover like, oh, I'm not a person who's just hangry and has cravings all the time. That's not me. Those were just symptoms of the roller coaster happening within. So the most common symptoms, cravings, fatigue, being hungry every couple of hours. Then other common symptoms, skin issues. Maybe you have acne, maybe you have eczema, psoriasis. These are all inflammation-based conditions. And the more glucose spikes you have, the more inflammation is going on in your body, so the more you're going to feel those symptoms. Then links to hormones is fascinating. So the more glucose spikes you have, the more you're on a glucose roller coaster. This can affect your adrenals, your thyroid, and your fertility. So polycystic ovarian syndrome, for example, which is becoming more and more prevalent in females, is tightly linked to too much insulin in the body. Really amazing. Then glucose roller coasters affect the brain. They affect your mood. They affect how nice you are to other people, which is, we can talk about this amazing study. And they affect your mental health and your brain fog. And then long term, balancing your glucose levels can help you just prevent the onset of diabetes. And even if you have type 2 diabetes, can help you improve it and even put it into remission, which happens quite often in my readers, actually.
I love it. Probably a lot of people who are listening today heard your first episode.
It was
you
great.
were on here on the podcast. It did really well and was probably one of our most top episodes during that month. So we're going to get into a whole bunch of new things here because you also have a new book and it's based on the similar principles, but the idea is how to help people get started with these hacks. Why is getting started such an important thing for you to want to make easy for your community and others that are listening today?
It really is, I think, one of my biggest motivators. When I meet somebody who's like, listen, Jessie, I know I have glucose spikes. Like I feel it, all the symptoms you list, I have them and I want to change, but I just don't know where to start. It feels overwhelming. I don't have the time, the capacity. You know, people are busy. Lots of stuff is happening in their lives and they don't necessarily know how to take that first step. So the second book, The Glucose Goddess Method, is essentially me moving in with you for 4 weeks and guiding you as you start implementing the hacks one by one. It's a bit of a book like, just sit back, relax, follow my lead. You don't have to think. I have lots of easy recipes in there. And I'm going to introduce these 4 fundamental hacks to your life in a way that feels effortless. And the reason I wrote this book is because after my first book last year, which covered, 10 hacks, lots of science, lots of stories, my personal story, etc. I started getting a lot of messages on Instagram, a lot of DMs that said, Jessie, I get it. Can you move in with me and help me actually do it? So this book was born out of that request. It's actually my best effort at moving in with you.
Yeah, because there's only one of you.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, well, I could clone myself. It's going to be a bit difficult. So I thought I'm going to make this book the second best thing.
Well, I want to first talk about, in conjunction with the launch of this book, link in the show notes. We'll have a little pic of it on the YouTube for everybody to see as well. You guys did a study. Tell us about that study, what you found. And I think, Tessa, you have the results brought up from that study in conjunction with the new book, The Glucose Goddess Method. Let's break it down.
So listen, I'm a scientist. I love studies. I love data. All of the hacks that I share are based on, well-established clinical trials that are done by amazing scientific teams across the world. But as I was putting together this 4-week plan based on that science, I thought, hey, what if I ran my own little pilot experiment? It's not like a controlled study, of course, it was just a little experiment. So I recruited 2,700 people in October 2022. So as I was just starting to write the book, and I had them go through this 4-week method. They had all the recipes that are in the book. They had exactly the same structure of the actual final Glucose Goddess Method. And I sent them surveys every week to see how they were doing, assess their symptoms, etc.
And they were monitoring their blood sugar using... No
monitoring, nothing.
So no monitoring.
No,
this is now just implementing the hacks and seeing how you feel.
Exactly.
And that's important to talk about because, CGMs, continuous glucose monitors, they're expensive. Not everybody has access to it, right? And you have to have access. Not everybody can also get it, even if you have the money, depending on the where in the world you live. So that goes right back into the book, which is how to implement the findings that are generally based on themes that can work for most people.
Exactly. And actually, when you wear a CGM, your objective is to feel better, have fewer cravings, be less hungry, sleep better. And so I just kind of skipped the step of the CGM. I was like, okay, let's just assess how you feel, right? Because as you go through the method, your glucose levels are flattening. So you're going to get those outcomes that people actually want. People want to wear a CGM for those outcomes.
Sure.
That's the objective. So I just sent surveys to people. They literally got a PDF of the book. And back, in October, it was not like a pretty designed PDF. It was just a very simple PDF. And every day they got a survey. And these are the results. So after the 4-week method, and by the way, Drew, we have to, I want to make sure that people understand this method is not restrictive. Like at no point in these 4 weeks do I ask you to cut out any foods or do anything like that. You just add 4 hacks to your life in 4 steps, 1 per week for 4 weeks. The rest of the time, you do whatever you want. Like you can eat anything you want, drink anything you want. It's not restrictive in any way. You're just adding these gentle giants to your life and then watching everything unfold. So the results. After the 4-week Glucose Goddess Method, 90% of people are less hungry all the time. 89% of people cut their cravings. 77% of people have more energy, which is so cool. 67% of people are happier, so effect on your mental health, on your brain. 58% of people are sleeping better. Another 58% of people improved their mental health. 46% improved their skin. Again, skin inflammation, that's very linked to glucose spikes. 41% of people with diabetes improved their diabetes just by adding these hacks into their lives, okay? It's amazing. 35% of people who had hormonal issues such as PCOS, etc., improved their hormones. And my favorite result, I think, is that 99% of people told me that these were new habits they were going to keep for life. And on the hormonal front, there were 3 women in the study that had been told for years that they would not be able to conceive naturally.
Wow.
They didn't have their period. They weren't ovulating. In the 4-week method, 3 of them got pregnant.
Huge.
3 glucose goddess method babies. And this is just on 2,000 people. So imagine, once millions of people get to this book.
This is the power of paying attention to the fact that we are living in an environment that is hijacking our biology.
Absolutely.
Because we have access to calories, and a lot of them, and many of them being super ultra processed, which makes it easier to overconsume on sugar.
Absolutely.
In all forms. Remind us, what are like the most common forms of, essentially we call it sugar, but it's way bigger than that, that is causing these ups and downs that are happening on the glucose roller coaster?
So there are 2 types of food that turn to glucose when you digest them and that cause glucose spikes. Starches, so bread, pasta, rice, potatoes, cereal, oats, etc. And what I call sugars, so anything that tastes sweet, from a fruit juice to a chocolate cake. These 2 categories of food, we eat way more of them nowadays. They're in all packaged goods. They're very cheap to produce. They're very addictive. So our food landscape is filled with them. And my philosophy is not to tell people just never eat those again, because
that's unsustainable.
Completely. And by the way, I love pasta and chocolate cake. I don't want to give it up. This is not negotiable for me. It gives us pleasure. These foods release dopamine in our brain. And dopamine is the pleasure molecule. So the question is, how do you keep eating those in a way that is less harmful to your glucose levels and in a way that is less addictive? That's the key. And the hacks in this method help you do that.
Do the hacks also, before we break them down, we're going to break all of them down.
Yeah.
A couple of things that I wanted to get a chance to get into. Do the hacks, you think, also help people consume? Most of the people in this audience, in my audience, would know that, okay, a calorie is not a calorie is not a calorie. And also on the flip side, like, sure, total calories matter. If you're going to overeat, even on quote unquote healthy foods, you're probably going to gain weight over a period of time, right? And then there's the question of what foods you eat make you crave certain foods, right? That's a big part of where your work is.
That's a big part, yes.
But do you think that also by following these hacks, you generally are in a place where you're eating less calories, and that's some of the impact of the results? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think so, because people end up eating more than usual, which is quite interesting. So a few of the hacks ask you to add food to your day. And people report to me like, oh, wow, I'm actually eating more than usual. And some of my fat is dropping without me even trying. So yes, of course, calories matter in the sense that they're a good determinant of like quantity, right? But 2 people can be eating the exact same number of calories, and one person can be having a lot of symptoms and the other person can feel great. Calories don't matter so much to me. I like using the idea of, it's like comparing 2 books that are 500 pages and saying they're the same book. It's like they're not the same book. Yeah, they're the same length, but they can be vastly different. You can have one book, which is, the Max Lugavere book, and you can have another one that's like, the stress solution, right? I mean, they're not the same book. So 2 foods or 2 diets that contain the same number of calories are not going to have the same impact on your body at all. So I don't think that's the impact. I think what happens is that people naturally with the hacks sort of switch some of their calories from processed foods that they were addicted to like, for example, the veggie starter, which is the week 3 hack. So they might be eating the same amount or a bit more than usual, but the molecules they're eating are so different. Instead of craving, the candy bar at 3 p.m., they're not adding a veggie starter to their lunches. So the effect on their body is completely different. And people feel fuller and they feel much better. So calories is not really the full story at all.
Totally. It's not the full story, but it's part of the story.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that most people would say that when you go for more refined items that typically are sugar or starches, as you mentioned, it's just easier to overeat because those foods make you crave more food.
Exactly. And also, like health, etc., doesn't happen in just a vacuum of like how many calories did you eat today. It's more like an overtime thing. So if you're eating in a way that keeps your glucose level steady, you're going to crave those foods way less. So over a month, for example, you might be consuming, I don't know, 1/10 of the usual sugary treats than you used to before. And so that's going to have an impact on your health for sure.
For sure. And especially if you look at America, which is probably a little bit different than where you live in Paris right now, right? You're in Paris?
I'm between the 2, but
okay,
yeah.
You're between the 2. One of the highest concentrations of calories that we have in America is liquid sodas.
Absolutely.
So when you start to pay attention to that and you're not getting that form,
Yeah.
and immediately just even cutting down a few soft drinks a week and replacing it
Or
with something
fruit
else.
juice.
Or fruit juice,
Yeah.
right? Or these crazy sugar bomb smoothies.
I know.
Or acai bowls. Maybe
know.
some of the audience is having some of those. In general, you start to be more mindful. And again, you're not going to be on that roller coaster, which is going to lead to less cravings. Okay, one more thing.
And one last thing on the calories. I think what most people find when they follow this method is that they can completely stop thinking about calories actually and just focus on these hacks and studying their glucose levels. And sort of naturally they reconnect with their body and they reconnect with how much they actually want or need to be eating. Because those calories that come from sodas, for example, they just mess up your whole hormone, hunger system. You're just clueless. Once you start studying things, you become a bit more connected. And your body and you become more like partners. So now I speak with my body. I'm like, hey, body, what do you want to eat this morning? And I kind of listen to it and it tells me maybe some salmon and some rice, which is what I had this morning. But you start creating more of a relationship. And so you take care of it, it takes care of you, and it's like a virtuous cycle. When you're stuck on a glucose roller coaster, it's a vicious cycle because you don't feel good. As a result, you crave dopamine producing foods like sugars. As a result, your body doesn't feel good. You're like, oh, my body is, against me. I hate it. And so you just keep going in that vicious cycle. But it's quite easy actually to just start it up the other way. You just need to put these things in place in your life.
Why I feel this is so important for even people that are deeply in the wellness space, which is going to be a lot of my listeners here, is that wellness food has gotten quite addictive in itself in that larger category. You go to Whole Foods, you go to Erewhon. Have you made a trip to Erewhon on this?
I live there, man. Every time I check out, they're like, are you a member? I'm like, no, but I should be.
So even in the wellness category, which there's so much wellness, I'm using it as a broad term, right? Even in the healthier for you category, it's at Costco, it's at Walmart, it's at Erewhon, it's at all these places that are out there. People are seeking it out. They're looking for better alternatives. And some of the best sellers, when you look at the statistics and you get these reports at what's selling really well at Whole Foods or Erewhon or Costco in that category, they're basically still chips. Okay, they might be in avocado oil, but they're still being made with, refined starches that are out there.
And probably smoothies.
And smoothies and other things that are there. So even I've seen from a lot of my audience, they start to feel like, wow, you know what? They might have heard an author say like, you should try gluten-free or you should try this, you should try that. But you can still, if you're not mindful and paying attention to glucose, you can still be on a wellness diet, quote unquote, whatever version of that is. But you're on this crazy roller coaster even within it and feeling like I don't feel any better. And I still feel like I'm dealing with weight gain, et cetera, other stuff.
Listen, any dogma can be abused, right? Any new trend that comes up, the food industry is going to grab and be like, let's make some products that have this label on them that look like they're wellness products, but actually not that good for you. This morning, I was at the coffee shop and there's this new thing, pistachio milk. People are all about pistachio milk now. And so I asked the barista, I was like, hey, can I have a look at the carton of pistachio milk that you guys use? And so she hands it to me. And of course, second ingredient, cane sugar. And I'm like, these people are ordering pistachio milk. They have no clue that they're just ordering sugar in water. So we have to be super careful about letting marketing lead our decisions. And that's why my work is all about just forget all that stuff. Whether you're gluten-free, vegan, paleo, keto, whatever the way you eat, you need to know about the science of glucose and how these molecules are actually affecting your body. And the hacks that I share, you can incorporate them whatever your lifestyle is, right? Whether you can't eat gluten or you want to just shop at Erewhon or whatever, these hacks will work for you. And that's really important. It cuts through all of that. And it's really about the biochemistry and the functioning of your body. And that's, thankfully, that's not a fad. That's not a trend. That's actual biology.
Absolutely. So the other thing that I want to chat about before we jump into it, I know I'm teasing it, we're going to get to it in a second, because my audience is more sophisticated on this topic.
Of course.
I asked you a little bit about this before we recorded, and it was the idea that you were sharing that glucose is just part of the story.
Absolutely.
And we want to pay attention to other things. And one of those things that we were talking about was insulin. Expand on that a little bit more.
So listen, glucose is a good way, it's a good angle at which to enter making changes in your life that are going to really help your physical and mental health, but it's not the full story. Stress, working out, sleep, hydration, emotional processing, community, of course, insulin, fructose, there's a lot of other pieces to this puzzle. And on the insulin topic, we were talking about this. So your glucose levels are actually not the best thing to track. And if we could, we would much rather track insulin levels.
Fasting insulin, right?
Yes, fasting insulin, or even for people who wear continuous glucose monitors, it would be way better to have a continuous insulin monitor. Yeah. And so we were talking about the fact that some people have higher fasting glucose levels, but maybe they're eating a very low carb diet. So they might wonder, like, why is my fasting glucose 95 when I never eat starches and sugars? Well, because glucose is not the whole story. So if you really want to see what's going on in your body and how far along the insulin resistance route you are, you have to measure fasting insulin as well. And then you do this thing, I don't know how to say it out loud, HOMA IR. I always just write it. The HOMA IR ratio. I don't know. Yeah. Maybe Tessa, you can pull it up. HOMA-IR. And this is the ratio you use to calculate how far along the insulin resistance spectrum you actually are. And you need fasting glucose and fasting insulin to do so. And that gives you a much better picture of your metabolic health than just fasting glucose.
Right. Yeah. And it's important for people to know because there's going to be variation that's inside. Yeah. HOMA-IR.
HOMA-IR. That's how you say it. Thank you. Sometimes I don't know how to speak English
Homeostatic model assessment for insulin resistance.
And Benjamin Bikman talks about this a lot. He's the insulin guy. And this is a much better place to actually measure what's really going on.
Yeah, I've heard people talk about this. And then sometimes in different studies, we recently had Dr. Susanna Soberg on the podcast. She's a cold therapy expert. And in her study that she did where she saw improvements in people's insulin, she also looked at like a glucose tolerance test. So people will do that, but that's difficult, for most people to do if you're not going to be working with a doctor. So just caveat to include, because it was amazing that so many people got excited and want to pick up a CGM and participate that there's going to be natural variations. And just like all things, we always grow up as an industry and people understand. And the good thing is if you ask your doctor nicely, right?
For fasting insulin,
they'll do it. And it's a very cheap test.
Yes.
And we have some articles we've written in the past about ideal markers, but generally at the Ultra Wellness Center and other clinics inside of functional medicine, they'll say like optimally we want to see patients at 5 or below, right? In some other places, they'll look at like 10 or below, but if you're between 5 and 10, again, the medical doctors at our clinic like to work on that a little bit because it could be a sign of other things. It's not just diet. Sometimes when we see somebody's fasting glucose is really high and their diet is really good and their insulin is still high, it's like, okay, great. Do you have sleep apnea that we have to work on? Do you have some levels of stress that are there that are chronic? Are there other things that are playing a role?
Is your gut messed up?
Is your gut messed up? Et cetera, et cetera.
There are lots and lots of really interesting paths to go down, but I totally agree with you. I think fasting insulin is a really nice place to start if you really want to see what's going on. And so when I first discovered the glucose world, I wore a glucose monitor for maybe like 1.5 years nonstop. And this was 4 years ago. And now I don't really do that anymore. I wear it once in a while to run some tests that I then share with my community. But I find that, it can be helpful, but also it can be quite overwhelming for some people. And also just the cost is quite prohibitive. So I hope that I can, that my part in this whole industry can be to give an option to people who can't afford that kind of stuff and who just want to get started in an easy and accessible way. That's really where I'm trying to get at. And even if you do wear a glucose monitor, I would highly recommend you grab my first book, Glucose Revolution, because I really break down like all the different kinds of things that affect your glucose levels, what matters, what doesn't matter, the hacks, etc. I want people to have as much education as possible around this topic because, again, it can be a little bit overwhelming. Sometimes you're like, is this normal? Is this spike normal? Is my fasting normal? Glucose monitors can be a bit inaccurate. I wore one last year that told me I was pre-diabetic. So I went to go check. My fasting glucose was 79, but the glucose monitor was telling me it was like 105. So I was like, whoa, if me, the glucose goddess, if I can be freaked out about this, imagine what most people might go through. So just make sure you have context so that if you do wear one, you know what's important and what's less important.
Absolutely. And really, most of the companies in the space that are doing good work in there are really helping people understand it's the variability, which is at the core central message of what you're talking about too. And that if you have a lot of variability, you're going to have symptoms of that variability, which goes back to even if you can't afford it, there's basic things that you can do to reduce that
Yeah.
variability.
And also you'll feel the results. You'll feel better energy. Your brain will be clearer. You'll sleep better, less hunger, less cravings. You'll see your skin improve. So that's the good news, right? We can actually feel the results within a matter of days. And that's what's so wonderful about it. And I think once you make that first step, you start feeling the effects so quickly that you just want to keep going. And that's how it solves the motivation issue, which is really something I care a lot about.
Absolutely. All right, let's talk about getting started.
Yeah.
Right? Do you feel that even before people jump into these 4 hacks, is there any sort of mentality or mindset people need to do before, like, is there a palate cleanse? Is there even a hurdle before you jump into things that gets in the way? Beliefs, ideas about ourselves, stories about what's possible and not. Any thoughts on that?
That's an interesting question.
Or another version of that question is, what are some of the common stories that you see or common beliefs that get in the way of people making progress in the first place on anything, including your methodology?
Well, I think this book is specifically trying to address one of the most strong pain points that I found, which was that people felt overwhelmed by all the information.
Overwhelmed.
And they didn't know where to start and which hack to start with. They didn't know what was more important. They didn't know like how to sequence things. That was really the piece that was blocking quite a few people. Just like, I want to do it, but I just don't know where to start. And that's why this book has been so successful in the study, of course, but also just in how excited people have been when I announced it. It's because it's solving that thing. And I think people just want more of a step-by-step guide. And I will keep making work and creating things that solves whatever hurdles and issue and overwhelm and just feeling that you can't get started that people may face. That's what I care a lot about.
Okay. So the first one is a savory breakfast,
Yes.
right? And I think that goes into this idea of getting started because it also relates to starting the day.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that so many people on this podcast have talked about is kind of like how you start the day, how you start the morning sets the tone for the rest of the day. I've noticed myself right now, we're dealing with sort of daylight savings here in the US. And we're in a place where a lot of people, by not having that hour of sleep that they've lost, I'm seeing with my wife, she's craving more, right? I'm noticing with myself, I went to a workout this morning, I felt a little bit off. So even how we sleep, how, getting that morning light, what we eat in the morning, those things are very important. They set the tone for the day. What have you found, before we get into the hack, when somebody starts off with a traditional starchy breakfast and sweet breakfast, typically what does that look like? And what are the results that stack later on in the day?
So the typical sort of glucose spiking breakfast is the breakfast that most people eat, which is, cereal, bread, jam, fruit juices, oats, anything that's just starches and sugars. And for most people who have been eating that way their whole life, and that was me in the past, they don't realize that breakfast is going to control them for the rest of the day. With a glucose spike at breakfast, they're putting a coin into the glucose roller coaster, which is going to make them spike, drop, spike, drop, spike, drop all day. It's going to make them hungry every 2 hours, craving foods, feeling tired, feeling fatigued. And that's where it comes back to, some people just think that's who they are. They just think that they're just somebody who's tired, who's cranky, who has a lot of cravings, who gets hangry. And actually, when you switch that, when you give to your body a breakfast that does not cause a glucose spike, it's like being in a movie and stepping through the mirror. You have a completely different experience of your day. And today, if you were to tell me, Jessie, okay, today just have some fun, eat a sweet breakfast, I would not do it because I know now how badly it impacts how I feel and my whole day. So by switching to a savory breakfast, which is a breakfast built around protein, essentially, and that does not contain anything sweet except some whole fruit for taste if you want, you keep your glucose levels steady. You actually unlock energy from within your cells. You help your mitochondria function better. You feel like awake for the whole day. And by, 12 or whenever lunch comes around, like you're happy to eat, but you're not famished. You're not feeling controlled by this impulse to just grab anything that's around you and near you. So it's really the pillar of a steady glucose life. And often when people change their breakfast from sweet and starchy to savory, their whole experience of life changes. It's quite remarkable.
Before I even really knew fully about the world of glucose and everything, even though my business partner has written one of like the early sort of bestsellers in blood sugar, I just naturally saw myself where I would have this kind of sugary smoothie bomb during my plant-based days. And as I got into the world of functional medicine and got more into healthy protein and all those things like that, I would see just how much more mental clarity. I think that's one of the first things that people notice, that energy and that mental clarity, that you can show up, you can pay attention, and it doesn't feel like this artificial spike up.
Exactly. And so 2 things on that. One, when you have sugar and starches at breakfast, you may think you're getting energy. What's actually happening is that dopamine is getting released in your brain. So you feel like, whoa, you feel awake. That's not energy. That's dopamine. And afterwards, you just crash. And second, let's talk about that brain clarity, the brain fog. I just read some really interesting papers that show us that one of the main symptoms in the brain of being on a glucose roller coaster is brain fog. Can you guess how the glucose roller coaster is leading to brain fog, Drew?
Tell us.
Okay. So every single cell in your body feels the effect of glucose spikes, which are inflammation, glycation, insulin release. And the cells in your brain also feel this impact. The cells in your brain are called neurons. Your neurons, when they're under stress from being on a glucose roller coaster, the speed of the signal between them slows down. Literally, the information in your brain slows down, and that can be felt as brain fog, which I find so fascinating, because the reason I even got into this whole thing in the first place was because my mental health was out of whack. I felt anxious, depressed, and I had this really intense brain fog. I would just feel like everything around me went from like 3D to 2D. I felt like there was a sort of weird like mesh between me and the world. It felt very blurry, very strange. And now, I understand, the more I was having spikes in my diet, the more often that was happening. There was a real correlation. So yes, to come back to what you were saying, when you switch from sweet and starchy breakfast to savory breakfast, brain clarity really improves. And as a result, when you're clearer and you have more energy and you feel better, you can be in your purpose more easily. You can connect with yourself and be like, this is what I want to do today. This is important to me. And you can go after the stuff you really want to go after, instead of being a victim to all of these symptoms that you don't know what to do about.
Yeah, it's like when you get that dopamine hit from a lot of refined starch or sugar, your brain is also kind of on that next dopamine hit of what's going to replace it.
Very addictive.
And part of what's addicted is also seeing what everybody else is up to, and the addiction. I've shared this before, but one of the toughest addictions to get over is the addiction of needing everybody else to tell you what you should pay attention to, what you should focus on, which also includes media.
Explain what you mean.
So there's a lot of people that have an addiction to not listening to their gut and needing the voice of others, media, social media, whatever. They want to know what's important that day. What should I pay attention to? Everybody else tell me what I should pay attention to. What should I prioritize? Sometimes on Twitter, they call it the current thing. What should I be upset about today? Right? Tell me what I should be upset about. Tell me what I should be enraged about. Tell me who's the enemy today?
Wow.
Who's the reason that I'm not able to pursue my dreams and goals in life? And that is an addiction. And I see when you start off the day with one addiction of sugar, and it's a quick dopamine spike, it's kind of like, all right, what's going to give me that next dopamine spike? Well, negativity actually can create a dopamine hit inside of the body. It's like, all right, cool. I know who I should be upset about. Here's who to blame. Here's what the government's doing wrong. Here's what this industry is doing wrong. Let's put the attention on them instead of, what do you want to do in your life? What do you want to give love and attention to? What do you want to write? What is that idea you've been sitting on? What is that business you want to create? What is that nonprofit you've been meaning to want to help out with? How do you want to reconnect with your partner or your kids or other stuff that intrinsically matters to you and is not the priority of somebody else?
Wow. Yes.
This isn't a conversation about not eating the things that we enjoy. It's a conversation about how do you eat the things that you enjoy and make modifications so that the food that you love can love you back. right?
Oh, I
So
love
let's give a
that.
practical example, right? You're
I
talking
love
about
the way
spiking
that you
our
love me like that.
glucose
Yeah.
first thing in the morning. And
Uh-huh.
the classic meal that often gets and talked about, and deservingly so, is the meal of oatmeal. So oatmeal
Yeah.
is a food that a lot of people talk about in this category of blood sugar, that it's like, oh, that food might be a no-no. Talk about what it looks like to start off your morning with oatmeal as a no-no, but then when you put in the glucose goddess lens on it, how you can actually make it work for you.
Absolutely. So oatmeal is a starch, right? And so when it lands in your system, it very quickly turns into glucose. So if you let it go out naked, it's going to create a big glucose spike. So we just need to put some clothes on it. That's all we need to do. So the most popular clothes to put on oatmeal in the morning, if you really want to eat oatmeal, are soft boiled egg, cauliflower rice, nut butter, seeds, protein powder, Greek yogurt. I mean, nuts, whole fruits. I would say berries are a really good option. Those are some really easy clothes to put on your oats to make them all of a sudden not too bad for your glucose levels. Because oats, I mean, in my personal experience, if you have naked oats, you're hungry so quickly afterwards, it's outrageous. It's really, it's really crazy. So by just putting clothes on it, you're able to eat the oats that you love, if you love oats, but without that big spike that's causing inflammation, that's causing aging, that's causing weight gain, that's causing cravings a few hours later. Yeah.
Right. And a lot of times people don't eat just oatmeal by itself. It's usually oatmeal, a glass of orange juice. And so now we
Yeah.
start to understand the cumulative effects of these foods that we're so trained to eat through
Hmm.
marketing and just TV and other stuff. And we can unpack that and unwind that and say, I can understand how every year I might gain additional pounds if that's something that
Yeah.
somebody's worried about. I can understand how every year, especially as I start to age, I feel hungry and hungrier, or I feel more
Hmm.
irritable later on in the day. So
Hmm.
understanding the connection between what we eat and how we feel is so central to our human species in so many categories. Another category, in addition to hunger and weight gain, and this is directly connected to that oatmeal story, is that my wife, when I first met her, she did like having oatmeal in the morning. And often the oatmeal that we get is there's sugar that's added to it if you're not making steel cut oats at home. So
Wow.
that's another aspect of where you get a glucose spike. And one of the things that she would notice when she started her podcast, she has a podcast where she interviews women who are like changing the game in business and like are self-starters. It's called Behind Her Empire. She would notice that when she has oatmeal first thing in the morning, and if she had an interview later on in the day, she has a really hard time focusing
Oh,
and paying
yeah.
attention. It's really a
Hmm.
struggle. So what do we know about glucose and its ability and being on that blood sugar roller coaster to impact our ability to focus?
Totally. And we should circle back to weight gain afterwards because I haven't gotten into it quite deeply yet. But so your brain needs glucose for energy too. The cells in your brain need glucose to think. And so your brain is actually incredibly sensitive to the amount of glucose in your body, so much so that there's the blood brain barrier that protects your brain from all the crazy stuff happening in your bloodstream. So when you have a glucose spike in your blood, your brain also feels a spike, a much smaller spike, but it's still enough to impact it. And so naturally, like things will change in the way your brain is functioning. On top of that, every glucose spike creates inflammation in your body. And your brain feels inflammation. It feels the oxidative stress. It feels that its mitochondria are being overwhelmed by this glucose spike. And so your brain has less available energy, and you just simply cannot think as well.
It's amazing because as we've talked about on this podcast before, inflammation is great. It's this tool that is like so helpful for our body and our repair process. But what we're talking about is the chronic aspects of all of these, chronically spiking your blood sugar. Sometimes when people
Mhm.
venture into the world of continuous glucose monitors, they start to think that they need to be balanced all the time. And
Mm.
really, that's not what we're shooting for. We're just trying to avoid the regular ups and downs. It's actually when we eat things, there should be a little bit of a bump up, but we just don't want that huge delta and that delta to be happening throughout the day. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's natural to eat things that turn into glucose in your body. Your body knows how to deal with small spikes, but this is what happens when you have a really big spike. So there are three main things that happen, and the third one is related to weight gain. So I'll go through them so we can understand really what's happening in the body. And by the way, this is what I'm the most passionate about, like explaining to people really the inner working, the biochemistry underneath your skin. I think it's amazing. So every time there's a glucose spike, glucose rushes to your cells and it goes straight to the mitochondria, because your mitochondria are the ones that are in charge of turning glucose into energy. That's their job. They're really good at it. However, if you give your mitochondria too much glucose, they're actually not super happy about it. It becomes overwhelming for them. And they're like, oh, Drew, I can't handle all this glucose. I'm just going to shut you off, shut down. And they literally just shut off. And this is a response to this huge influx of glucose that they cannot deal with. And as your mitochondria are shutting off, they're going to be releasing these little molecules called free radicals, which have large consequences on the body. Free radicals, anything they touch, they damage. So if they touch your DNA, they're going to make little mutations that could lead to cancer. If they touch the membrane of your cells, they're going to lead to little holes in it, which could, at the end of the day, actually damage the structural integrity of your cells. And so your body is going to try to respond to these free radicals by increasing inflammation. If you're spiking all the time, inflammation is happening all the time. And chronic inflammation is the root cause of most diseases. 3 out of 5 of people in the world are going to die of an inflammation-based disease. So that's the first reason glucose spikes are not good for us. The second thing that happens when we spike, this blew my mind, Drew. Honestly, when I realized the connection between glucose spikes and wrinkles, which I'm going to explain, I was just like, okay, this is incredible. Everybody needs to know this. So when there's glucose in your body, it's just running around like a kid on the playground. I mean, glucose goes everywhere and it touches all the stuff that it finds. When glucose bumps into another molecule, any type of molecule, it actually slightly damages it. It does what's called glycation. So it glycates other molecules. And when a molecule is glycated, it is damaged forever. Now, if glucose bumps into a molecule of collagen, for example, which is the protein you need to have a nice skin and nails and hair, it damages the collagen. As a result, you get wrinkles. I mean, it's incredibly straightforward, the connection. Of course, you don't just get wrinkles, like a lot of other stuff happens in your body. And glycation is actually the reason we end up dying. Glycation is like toasting, like a piece of toast in the toaster. That's glycation. So that's the second thing that happens when we have glucose spikes. And your body is trying to protect you against all this because your body knows that all these terrible things are happening. So it has this very elegant solution. Anytime your glucose spikes, your body releases insulin. And insulin's job is to take glucose and put it the away so that it doesn't lead to these harmful consequences in your body. And so where does insulin put glucose away? In your liver, in your muscles, and then when those are full, it puts it away in your fat cells. So you gain weight. All this to say that weight gain is actually a protection mechanism that your body has to protect you from glucose spikes. So when we put on weight, we should be saying, thanks, body, for protecting me against all that inflammation and aging.
Yeah, and not to mention, there's a whole history around and the evolutionary process of when we would have access to certain fruits that were in season, late summer, early fall. A lot of that was getting us ready to fatten up in the same way that bears eat a bunch of berries before they go into hibernate and gain can gain sometimes 200, 300 pounds before they go into hibernation is like, eating these fruits and these other things that would help us spike our blood sugar on purpose would help us fatten up so that we could survive, winter. And there's a whole element of uric acid being connected into there and other stuff. And there's plenty of people that have written about that connection. So it's like our weight, as you said, is a protection mechanism. It's also an energy storage. It's like an extra charger, that we have for our iPhone to make sure that it doesn't run out.
A portable fridge. It's our own personal fridge.
Right. But now, because we're spiking our glucose all the time, and that's really your central message. This is happening all the time. And the variability that's happening throughout the day, it's leading to a whole host of problems.
Yes. And also keep in mind that There's actually different kinds of spikes. So if you're spiking from something starchy, it's just glucose that's causing these issues because there's only glucose in starchy foods. If you're spiking from something sweet, so like candy, cookie, dessert, ice cream, there's also fructose in there. Fructose lives hand in hand, as Dr. Lustig says, lives hand in hand with glucose in sweet foods. And fructose ages us, inflames us, and makes us put on fat at an even greater rate than glucose alone. And that's why one of my hacks is if you want to snack, if it's the middle of the day and you're just hungry, pick something savory, starchy, instead of something sweet. Because as a result, you're going to be helping your body not have all these consequences. And if you want to eat a sweet thing, have it as dessert after your next meal so that because of everything else in your stomach and intestine, your body's actually protected and is going to absorb less of all that stuff.
No, I love that. That's a whole section in your book,
Yeah.
pick dessert over a sweet snack.
Yeah.
And I think that these little things, hats off to you. I know you spent a lot of time on this book. These little quick little things that people remember. They may not
Mm.
understand all the mechanisms. The mechanisms are there for them to reference. The studies are there for them to reference, but they remember these little things like, okay, yeah, what did she say? Okay, put clothes on your carbs. And
Yeah.
if we can get that into the zeitgeist, if we can
Ah.
memify it, which you've been doing a great job doing, these things now become the primary way, but they're actually backed up with evidence because
Mhm.
some of the ways that these memes and marketing things have gotten out there, and I'm going to talk about one that you've explored and chatted about, they've infiltrated society, but there may not be the evidence around them. So let's talk about one of them. Eating fruit on an empty stomach. So many people
Yeah.
think that if you want to eat fruit, that the healthiest way to do that is eating fruit on an empty stomach. What did you find out about that sort of meme that's been out there in the
Mhm.
world for such a long time and its origin stories?
Yeah. So I did a lot of research on this because one of the hacks that I talk about, which is so cool, is that when you're having a meal, you should eat your food in a specific order to reduce the glucose spike by up to 75%. And the correct order is veggies first, protein and fats second, starches and sugars last. And fruit fall in the sugars category because they have a lot of naturally occurring sugars in them. And so I started putting that out there, and people were like, but Jessie, what about that thing that you should never eat fruit after a meal? Otherwise, it's going to rot in your stomach and ferment, and all these bad things are going to happen. So I was like, hey, I'm going to research this. I'm a scientist, I'm a researcher. So I was like, I don't know, I'm going to find out. It took me a little bit of time to understand where this came from, but I finally found the source. It was a doctor in the Renaissance who wrote this thing saying that you should never eat fruit after a meal because otherwise it will send these putrid vapors and nauseous gases into your body, leading to rotting and all this health damage. But this has no modern scientific support, although Ayurvedic uh, proponents actually also talk about this, that fruit should only be eaten on an empty stomach. So you're kind of balancing these things. You're balancing the fact that in modern scientific evidence, this is not a thing. And it actually turns out that from a glucose perspective, it's better to eat fruit at the end of the meal. And then you have these potential myths that we don't really know, what the backing is for them. So I'm in the camp of follow the latest science, unless you personally feel that, if you have fruit after a meal, something happens. Some people get some gas or bloating, but for most people, having fruit as dessert is totally fine. And if that's the case for you, definitely follow the latest cutting edge glucose science saying that fruit should be eaten last.
And I come from a background where Ayurveda is part of my tradition and lifestyle, and we
Yeah.
grow up with our grandparents giving a lot of, saying a lot of things about doshas and what foods are good for different doshas that are there. And I think one thing for people to also understand is that we have to look at the lens of how has modern life also modified a lot of these things that could actually be good from a Ayurvedic perspective, but maybe different in the world that we live in today. So a classic example is that in Ayurveda, they often will recommend dairy. So a lot of growing up, people would say, oh, because your dosha and everything like that, you would really do well with dairy. It's cooling for you, it's grounding for you, it's other stuff. So there was a period of my time growing up, and I was a vegetarian growing up, where I was consuming a lot of dairy. And nobody really told me, and they didn't really know that the dairy here, especially in the United States, it's better off in Europe and other places, it's full with all sorts of crap inside of it. Not to mention we were drinking skim milk, which is also going to be something that's going to spike you more often than full fat dairy that's there. So we have to look at the lens of how things have sort of changed in our modern world. And is it the fruit that's causing a little bit of bloating? And sometimes people will say, well, don't mix too many different things because your enzymes cannot digest. Or is it the meal that you just had and you just happen to have it? So I think running experiments is great. This is why I also think that having a continuous glucose monitor is also a great tool to be able to show you. And try it, try it. Well, even if you wanted to have fruit on an empty stomach, at least if you could have some fattier fruit, like having
some
avocado,
cheese or some nuts,
cheese
even
or
with
nuts,
the fruit.
even with the fruit, like a charcuterie board, even that would make a significant difference in making sure you didn't have that strong variability throughout the day.
And so do you still drink dairy or eat dairy now? What's the situation?
Well, what's interesting for me is that at the age of 18, I went to a conference, and at that conference, that was part of, that had a lot of, it was basically like a meditation conference that the Jain community was hosting, this religious community out of India. And I went to go explore it and get more in touch with my roots. I had actually learned, it was the first time that I had heard somebody say that dairy can be linked to inflammation in the gut and our gut microbiome. And I was like, what? That is crazy. I'd never heard that. Now, I was suffering with systemic, really bad acne that I had in high school. All throughout my 4 years of high school, as soon as I hit puberty, my acne was really, really bad. And I heard the individual say that, if you have a lot of inflammation in your gut, and remember, this is back in the year 2000. Not a lot of people were talking about this thing.
Oh yeah, it was cutting edge back then.
Cutting edge back then. They said that if you are suffering with acne, cut the dairy out. And they were trying to talk about it more from an animal rights perspective, right? Like our cows are being mistreated. We want to get people off of dairy. They're mostly talking to an audience of vegetarians, and all my friends are like, cut out dairy? We literally do not eat anything. Like, how the hell are we going to cut out dairy? Like, that's the only thing that we, are left to eat that we actually enjoy. What the hell are we going to be able to order at Taco Bell and all these other places? But because I was suffering so much with acne, I said, you know what? Let me try. I cut out dairy. And through that process, I started looking around the health food store. And without even realizing it, I started cutting out. I knew nothing about glucose. I knew nothing about sugar spikes, other things. I naturally was cutting out a lot of foods that would typically be the foods that would spike you, because I was eating less processed foods, right? And I was just going to a more whole food diet. And within a month and a half, my skin completely cleared up, and everybody was like, whoa, what drug are you on? What thing did you take? What skin cream did you have? And I tried all that stuff. I tried, all the gels and the creams and other stuff, and it wasn't making a difference. So I'm off of, I went off dairy. And then later on in life, I realized a few years ago that you can include high quality dairy into your diet in a way that makes sense for you. So I have a little bit of goat's cheese. I have goat kefir, and
I love goat cheese.
And I make sure that it's not pre-sweetened with the sugar the companies add it into, not the cheese, but the kefir and the yogurts. And it doesn't spike my blood sugar. I feel full, and I don't get that reactionary process that's there.
So the acne was a symptom, was a message from your body that something was wrong in your gut, right?
Exactly. And that is the moral of so much of this, is that, you say it well, and I've heard you in other interviews say it, your symptoms are a signaling process. They're just letting you know that something is up in your life. And this is a great opportunity to talk about your origin story before we go deeper into the topic of glucose and how it impacts our long-term health with things like cancer, aging, Alzheimer's, and a whole host of other things. Tell us about how a major event in your life kind of opened your eyes to this whole world that you talk about in your book and on social media.
Looking back, I really did not expect this to take me here today, but that's just life. When I was 19, I had a freak accident and I broke my back. One of my vertebrae exploded, and I had very intense surgery. And for a while, the symptoms were, I was just in a lot of freaking pain, like a lot of pain in my back and my legs, etc. But very quickly, my body healed because I was young and I was, generally doing well. But then had a lot of mental health issues. I had this thing called depersonalization, which is a really weird sensation where you leave your body. It's close to dissociation. It was very, very stressful for me. Nobody around me knew what it was. I felt very alone, but it became very clear, Drew, that my number one objective needs to be to wake up every morning feeling well. Because if I don't have that, nothing matters. Literally nothing matters. I couldn't work, I couldn't be creative, I couldn't love, I couldn't live if my health was not there. And so at the young age of 19, that became my focus. I just had to figure out how to wake up in the morning and feel okay. It was as simple as that. So I had just finished a bachelor's degree in mathematics. So I was on the science path. I thought it was really interesting. And I went to grad school to study biochemistry to sort of try to understand, okay, how the does this thing work my body that I'm piloting? Like, how does it work? So I went and studied that. And then that gave me some answers, but I still didn't feel good when I woke up in the morning. Then I went to work in the field of genetics in San Francisco at the company 23andMe. I don't know if you're familiar. And I stayed there for 5 years, and I wanted to understand how my DNA worked because I thought, well, if my DNA created my body, if I understand DNA, then I can understand my body and how to feel well, right? Again, not that helpful to me. I mean, your DNA is helpful to tell you what diseases you might get, but it doesn't tell you what to do to wake up tomorrow feeling amazing. And serendipitously, while I was there, I put on a glucose monitor for the first time. There was this pilot study we were doing inside the company. It was just a few people testing this device out. I put it on, scanned it with my phone, saw my glucose level there on my screen, and it just clicked completely. I was like, oh, this is what I've been waiting for. Finally, something that could help me understand what was going on the inside. And so I developed this very intimate relationship with my glucose levels. And I realized, Drew, that when my mental health was not okay, when I was having episodes of depersonalization, they often correlated with my glucose levels spiking. And so that was just the beginning of everything for me. I was like, okay, I get it. The point is keep my glucose levels steady. And this was 4 years ago. So back then nobody was really talking about it yet. And so I dove into all the research and I realized, oh my God, 90% of people are having glucose spikes every day. And oh my God, look at all these hacks that I can summarize from the scientific studies. And I created this sort of new lifestyle for myself using all my glucose hacks. And I healed. I healed not only my mental health issues, I healed my skin, my period became regular again. I was able to understand how to wake up in the morning feeling amazing. I had steady energy all day. It was a total revolution for me. And it was really the answer I had been looking for almost 10 years. I mean, it was a while of searching. And this gave me many, many answers. I mean, of course, I'm still a work in progress, lots of other things that I'm still working on, but this was really fundamental to me feeling well and to me being able to create and be in the world in the way that I wanted to be in the world and to be my optimal self.
It's such an important reminder. First of all, like all of us, you're a beautiful work in progress. We're all a work in progress. We're all working on the
Totally.
different things that are there.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that, there are so many categories of life. When the dots start to connect, there's so many categories of life. Once you start to go down the rabbit hole of glucose, insulin, that whole world, and our optimal metabolic health, there's so many things that we have no idea that in some way are either directly connected or made worse when our blood sugar is out of control. And for you, it took a major event, as it often does for a lot of heroes. They have their hero's journey. They have that life-opening moment that sets them on the path. But I honor your commitment to continue working on yourself, but then also to share it with other individuals. What started happening when you were sharing the first time that you started telling people, like, hey, this is what happened to me, and I am getting better, and this seems to be what the literature's saying. Let's have you try it too, and let's see what happens. Do you have any anecdotes or early stories from the first time that you started sharing this knowledge that you were building up, and what response you were getting and what people were feeling from practicing your advice?
Yeah. So picture this. I'm in San Francisco and I have a million tabs open on my internet browser and I'm making all these changes to my life and I'm feeling amazing and I'm discovering all this science. So I printed out some scientific papers and I was like, I'm going to show my friends so they can feel good too. And so I went to my friends and I was like, look, Thomas, this study says that you should eat your food in the right order and you'll feel amazing. And I was like, read it, read it. Crickets, man. Like nobody cared about the scientific papers. They were like, okay, Jessie, whatever. And I'm kind of I get excited about stuff. So they were like, let's dismiss this, like a lot of other things. And so I thought to myself, okay, this is actually just a communication issue. Like I really believe this is life-changing information. I just need to understand how to communicate it to people because the science is there. The problem was nobody cared. So my mission became how do I get people to see what's happening? How do I get them to care and to try this? So I thought I'm going to use data from my own continuous glucose monitor to illustrate these principles that have been found in the scientific papers. So I wrote this little piece of software because the app that the glucose monitor came with was not doing what I wanted it to do. So I wrote this piece of software that so scrappy, so like startup Silicon Valley vibes. The software extracted the data from my glucose monitor and created these pretty graphs that I have to this day on my Instagram and that are the foundation of my work. And it allowed me to put side by side the glucose spikes created by two different things. So for example, eating a piece of bread on its own versus eating the bread with some avocado on it. The piece of bread on its own was a bigger spike and bread and avocado a smaller spike. And I would just put them side by side. And then I started showing these images to my friends. And then they got very interested. I mean, humans are visual creatures. And all of a sudden they were like, oh, whoa, cool. And they got it. And I was like, yes, I solved it. And so I kept doing it. And I kept illustrating the scientific papers with my own data. And my friends started doing the hacks. And they felt so much better. So then they started showing the hacks to their families and their friends, and people started feeling better. And then they said, hey, can you put this online somewhere? Because I was just texting these to my friends, these little graphs I had made. And so I was asked to put these online. And so I created an Instagram account and I started just sharing the graphs. And I haven't stopped. It's been 3 years. And now many, many people are benefiting from this illustration of the science. And that's what I love so much. I've turned these incredible scientific discoveries done by these teams across the world into something that people get. I've solved the communication issue. And it gets me just so fired up to have done this because I think it's awesome.
It's really this next wave of, a lot of papers that get written and you talk to the individuals behind it. They're lucky if a few hundred people, in their field end up reading that thing. And yet there's so much gems. There's so many gems and knowledge that are buried in it. And scientists don't typically, let's say that first generation, they above us, they don't typically get that training in the communication. In fact, they're discouraged. They're discouraged to talk about the practical applications of it because they don't want to seem like an advocate. They have to stay very neutral. And they have to end all their statements with, and we've had some of those people on the podcast, and I get how hard it is. They have to end their statements with, well, more science is needed on this topic, right? But there's plenty of things that we can take away from, and the public is just, confused, and they're looking for answers. Yeah. And the alternative is, if the scientists don't speak up and start sharing in a practical way that makes sense, then media will hop on the bandwagon and sensationalize things. And there was even a report that came out a few years ago that of the headlines that talk about scientific papers featured in different journals, 40% of the headline gets the entire paper wrong.
Yes.
In terms of what is actually being talked about. It's crazy. A lot of things play into that. Agendas, et cetera, sensationalism, clicks, whatnot. So the fact that you are taking that time to walk people through it and doing it on a visual realm. Some people are more written, some people more visual. We all need to hear things in a different way. Makes a huge difference in, again, the stickiness of us remembering things. So let's talk about a couple of those that are there and how they help us maybe understand a context or a category. So one that I thought you did a pretty good job with was rice. So tell us what you found out about rice and whether or not there's a difference between white rice and brown rice. And then if you could follow that up with how can we enjoy rice in a little bit more of a responsible way that doesn't have our body, constantly on that blood sugar roller coaster.
Yeah. So there's this whole thing about whole grain rice, brown rice, and it's been marketed very heavily. And now we believe that anything that's whole grain or a little bit browner is automatically a health food. So if you look in the supermarket, the white rice versus the brown rice, you think to yourself, okay, well, if I'm just going to pick the brown rice because it's going to be so much better for me. The white rice, horrible, horrible, horrible. Brown rice, super good, super healthy. It turns out that I tested both white rice and brown rice. I ate the exact same quantity, and the glucose spikes were virtually the same. And this is actually not that surprising when you look at the difference from a molecular level between white rice and brown rice. Brown rice has like a tiny bit more fiber, a tiny bit more protein than white rice, but it's still rice. I mean, those two things are incredibly similar. If you actually want to make an impact on your glucose levels while eating rice, it is a million times, well, don't quote me on a million times, but much, much more powerful to put clothes on your rice than to change the color of the rice. So pick the rice color that you prefer. I prefer white rice personally, and put some spinach in there. Put some eggs, put a piece of fish, put some butter, some olive oil, some green peas, some sea salt and nice spices, and just dress it into a meal that doesn't contain just starch. And when you do that, I mean, then you actually flatten the glucose curve, and then you actually help your body. But just switching from white rice to brown rice or white pasta to brown pasta, no impact.
Not to mention the fact that, for generations, for thousands of years, why did all these societies go through all this hassle to dehusk rice? Brown rice is a more recent phenomenon. And from what I understand, it really started to emerge in the movement of like the macrobiotic movement here in America. Not that people weren't eating wild rice and other components that were there, but in Asia, primarily India, China, Japan, there was not as popularity around brown rice. And in fact, people knew that brown rice in particular could cause a little bit of gut irritation. Maybe it's the anti-nutrients inside of the rice. Maybe it's the, whatever it might be that's there. So that's another thing that I share is that there's so many people that are eating brown rice because they think it's healthy, but also they could be causing some digestive upset. More importantly is that rice, just like sugar, which we'll get to in a second, it's all the same. Be careful. Maybe don't have as much as rice if you were normally centering your entire 2 meals a day, single meal a day at dinner, which is very common in the Indian community. Like my parents, before they wore their glucose monitors, would have rice, a big bowl of rice every dinner. And now they put cloves on their rice and they just have minimized it. They can still enjoy the taste, but they're not having as big of a quantity, and they've both seen massive shifts in their blood sugar regulation throughout the day.
That's great. Another thing they could do is also eat the rice last. So if they still wanted that big bowl of rice, start the meal with a salad, like a whatever, green salad with some fat and some protein in there, and then have the rice. Because what happens when you do that, when you start your meals with vegetables, and that's another one of my hacks, the fiber in the vegetables, when it lands in your stomach and your intestine, it actually coats the inside of your intestine with this cool mesh. And the mesh prevents your body from absorbing too much of the glucose coming through afterwards. So they can still enjoy the bowl of rice, but with a much smaller glucose spike because they're going to be absorbing less of the glucose molecules.
I always love how you bring it back to that, because the central messaging on behavior change is also when you tell people to not do something at all, there's a little bit of like that child in all of us. It's like, oh, you're going to tell me to not do something? F you, I'm going to go and go ahead and do it.
I'm totally like that. I'm the worst at this.
Well, it's good. Yeah. It's good that you have that, because you can also have that empathy for people who are just trying to go about their day. They're trying to figure things out. They don't have all this time, and they don't even often have the finances right now, because unless they're diabetic, their insurance is not going to cover a glucose monitor and it's expensive. They're just looking for these simple things that are there. Yes. And as we know, heading in the right direction is a big part of the process, especially when we start talking about accessibility. There's a whole group of people that don't listen to podcasts, that are not going to pick up a book, and that are working 2 or 3 jobs a day just to survive. So if you can have these little things that you can share with them, these little gems, these little takeaways, it's going to make health way more available to a whole host of people that previously wouldn't have paid attention to that topic and are fighting against all the onslaught of marketing that's available to them. Let's take another category and another image. I have your Instagram pulled up, and that is this post that you had. Let's talk about the right order when it comes to pasta. Pasta is a dish that a lot of people like, and you talked about the difference between pasta, having it before having a certain veggie. I'll let you talk about that veggie versus having it after having that veggie. Can you break that one down?
Yes, and I love pasta. So when I first put on a glucose monitor and I was going through this whole process, I was like, I need to figure out how to eat pasta without a glucose spike because it's non-negotiable. I grew up eating so much pasta and Parmesan. It's like I still eat Parmesan every single day. I probably have eaten like 2,000 pounds of the thing now that I've been on this earth for 30 years, but I love pasta. So I had to figure out how to eat it. Pasta is a starch. So if you eat it on its own, it's going to create a big glucose spike. What I devised was this very cool trick that actually merges 2 hacks. So before I have a big plate of pasta, I will have a salad. So like green leaves, arugula, rocket, spinach. And then I will make a vinegar dressing on the pasta. And if I have the salad before the pasta, I'm able to lower the glucose spike of the entire meal by 50%. So we're talking, I just had the pasta that I love, but I'm cutting the glucose spike in half, which means half the amount of inflammation, half the amount of aging, half the amount of weight gain, half the amount of crazy hormonal dysregulation and, cravings appearance in the afternoon. So vegetables with vinegar before starches, super, super important. The fiber in the veggies coats your intestine. The vinegar in the veggies tells your muscles to absorb the glucose really quickly as it lands in your bloodstream. And as a result, you're able to enjoy the starches without so many consequences. However, if you have the pasta first and then you have the salad, you don't see this big impact. The order of the food is important. It's important to eat the starches after the vegetables to get all these benefits.
So put yourself in a typical situation where people are going out to dinner, and the sequencing of sort of the bread, the appetizers, and the entrees that come in, and dessert. Talk about the consequences of doing it in the typical way and contrast that with, and you write about this inside of your book, you put people through these different scenarios. Talk about that with the contrast of a different way that we could go about things to protect our body.
Typical thing, you sit down, you're starving, they serve you bread as you're looking through the menu. Typical thing, you reach for the bread and you eat a whole lot of bread. Now what's happening is that the bread is landing in your stomach. There's nothing else in your system. Very quickly, it breaks down into glucose and ends up in your bloodstream. So before you've even started your meal, you're already starting to see this glucose spike. Then you eat your regular meal, and maybe 45 minutes in, your glucose levels are starting to crash from the bread that you ate first. As a result, the craving center in your brain activates, and it's like, Drew, you're super hungry, eat more. And then dessert time rolls around, and they ask you if you want a dessert, and you're like, oh my God, yes, I need a dessert, I need sugar, I need something sweet. That's because your glucose is dropping from that piece of bread that you had at the very beginning. Now, new way to go to the restaurant. Glucose goddess way of eating. They serve the bread. You're like, that looks really tasty. I'm going to have it in 5 minutes. You order a vegetable-based starter. It can be anything. It can be beans. It can be sauerkraut. It can be kimchi. It can be broccoli, tomatoes, whatever. You have that first. Then you have your main with the bread. And actually, it's quite helpful because when you have the bread during the main, you can actually use the bread to sauce everything, which I love doing. But most importantly, you're still eating the bread, but because of the fiber that's in there from the vegetable starter, you don't have this big glucose spike. And as I mentioned in the beginning, when your glucose levels are steadier, your hunger hormones are steadier as well. So it's time for dessert, and you probably don't really crave anything sweet. So maybe you just split dessert with your friends instead of feeling like you need an entire, apple crumble to yourself. And so you're starting to feed your body in a way that makes it happier. You feel better mentally. You realize that it's not a willpower issue. It's really just what you put in is actually going to make you feel a certain way. And if you eat to keep your glucose levels steady and balanced, you're going to feel amazing. It's going to feel like a superpower. Your body's going to become your friend, and it's going to be a whole new world.
That's it. You're unlocking a whole new world. We talked a lot about some of the shorter term consequences of not having our glucose balanced and our blood sugar balanced. I'd love to touch on some of the longer term things that are there. I'll see these different posters sometimes that life is short, eat whatever you want, do the things that you want to do. And listen, I want people to eat whatever they want to eat, and I want people to just be happy. And if you're happy, amazing. And if we can reduce some human suffering along the way, that's a beautiful place. Leave the world a better place than we came across this. What a lot of people don't understand is that it's not just about not having optimal focus. It's not just about not feeling your best. It's not just about hunger and weight gain. There's other chronic diseases that are directly tied into irregular and crazy blood sugar. So let's talk about the first one. And this is laid out inside of your book. And that first one that I want to talk about is cancer. What do we know about cancer and its connection to blood glucose?
The main connection we see here is that cancer is a disease that is linked to inflammation. And as I mentioned, every time a glucose spike happens in your body, you increase your inflammation levels. So as a result, the terrain for cancer to grow is just much more fertile. Another thing I mentioned was the free radicals that your mitochondria release whenever there's a glucose spike. These free radicals, as I mentioned, anything they touch, they damage. If they touch your DNA, they damage it. And these damages can actually be the mutations that start the proliferation of cancer, that start those cells that are dividing endlessly and that create tumors. In the studies, it's very clear. You can see that people who eat in a way that spikes their glucose levels more have a higher risk of developing cancer. And it's becoming, it's everywhere. I think the stat is 1 in 3 children born today are going to get cancer in their lifetime. It's everywhere, and it's very connected to our food. Now, obviously, there are other things that play, for the development of cancer. You have the big ones like smoking, stress, lack of exercise. There's a lot of power in our plate. And the issue with these chronic diseases is that you don't know you have them until you get diagnosed. And so often it's difficult to think, okay, I'm going to do these things to prevent diseases that I might not even get. But the cool thing about the glucose hacks is that they kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Not only are you going to feel better today, because you're not going to have any more cravings, your skin is going to get better, your sleep is going to improve, but you're also helping long-term your body not develop cancer and other diseases. So it's really fundamental to today and tomorrow.
Tessa, let's see if we can find this. Maybe we'll search like Drew Prowett, blood sugar, panic-induced anxiety or panic attacks, Kristen Allett. And she wrote an entire book around panic attacks. And in her clinical experience, she said that she had never seen anybody who fell into, again, this is her own clinical experience, a full-blown panic attack who did not just have consumed some protein or fat, or if somebody was in the middle of a panic attack, in addition to breathing and slowing down, she would actually have her patients right then in front of her eat some beef jerky, turkey jerky, something to help stabilize them. And she found that helped them get out of panic attacks quicker. Now, she was not fully aware of all the continuous glucose monitors. That wasn't on her radar. I kind of shared that with her. This was done a few years ago. But this is the extreme version, that there are people that are actually struggling with deep panic attacks, and that there seems to be at least some clinical evidence, which is part of it. We think of clinical studies as being the only thing. A lot of times that how clinical studies get started and people wanting to explore is that it starts off with some version of clinical evidence or community evidence, people reporting back and seeing something is there. So she's been seeing, and other practitioners in the same boat, that there seems to be some connection with panic attacks and blood sugar.
That's fascinating.
Have you noticed or seen anything in that world?
Well, one of the symptoms of having like very low blood sugar can be to feel anxiety and nauseous and sweats, etc. And just being on a roller coaster itself is a stressor for the body. So it can increase the symptoms of anxiety, depression if you already have a terrain for that. So, it kind of makes sense that your mental health is very connected. In terms of her own experience, like I don't have patients, so I wouldn't be able to say, but it's really interesting.
Well, one of the things she was saying before we move on is evolutionarily, like if we are having a major blood sugar dip, we get a spike of cortisol. We have all these stress hormones that get released. And it's basically, if I don't get food, I'm going to die.
Yeah.
And literally that's how some people feel. They literally feel like they're in a situation. You add a life stressor on top of it,
Absolutely.
some crazy email you get from your boss, whatever, some bad news, unfortunately. And now your body actually feels like it's dying. Now, for those that are out there, of course, there's so much more to the story about panic attacks. Yes, work with a therapist, all those things. But I would love to see if somebody would dig deeper in this aspect of the connection of blood sugar, because there feels like there's something that's there.
I love it. Last time I had a panic attack was in an MRI, and I can tell you I had a savory breakfast before, so it was not my glucose levels, but those things freak me out.
Yeah, there's just some things that might be triggering and anxious for people. Yeah. And I'm sorry that you had that experience.
It's okay.
Okay, let's talk about anything more you wanted to add about movement of just, I think we hit it all, but anything else?
You're good.
Okay, let's talk about hack number 3. Set it up for us.
So in week 3 of the method, you're adding a vegetable starter to one of your meals a day. So most people do that before lunch or before dinner. And the concept is when you start your meal with vegetables, the fiber in the vegetables has time to do something quite amazing. The fiber goes into your stomach, then in your upper intestine. And there it sort of deploys itself onto your intestinal wall, forming a very protective, healthy mesh. That mesh then prevents your body from absorbing too many glucose molecules coming down from the rest of the meal. So it's a very, very amazing protective thing to do. And it asks you to add and it asks you to add food to your life. You're not taking away anything. You're just adding this veggie starter, and as a result, reducing the spike. And Tessa, if you go back to the Amazon page and then you scroll to the right, you'll see a recipe. Scroll a bit to the right here. So this is an example of one of the veggie starter week recipes. There are many, many here, but they're all really fun. All ask you to just prepare something in 5 to 10 minutes. It's very simple. And by adding this veggie starter hack, you're going to see a very big difference in your cravings, energy level, hunger levels, because you're harnessing the power of that fiber. And I think this is my favorite week. The recipes in this week are just insane.
That's amazing. Can you describe this recipe? And
so here we see the fancy zucchini rolls to share. And a lot of the recipes in the book, I wanted to make them easy to share. So if you're having friends over, if you're cooking for a family, etc. So this is a simple recipe where you need cheese, basically, frozen spinach, nutmeg, pine nuts, and a small zucchini. And you make these little rolls that look almost like sushi rolls, but they're your veggie starter rolls. It's amazing. Just looking at this photo, I can taste the filling. It's so delicious. So veggie starter week 3, super powerful, incredible. I love it.
I love it. And I love the photographs. It's the glucose goddess style. What would you say? Is that like sort of, it feels very French inspired, but also like sort of like classic modern American, like how would you describe it?
Oh man, I tried to find some words. To me, it feels like rainbow, colorful, but also quite retro and a little bit like just space alien vibes. Yeah. Like especially the photos with the eggs, and a lot of the photos that have my hands in them, to me, they feel a bit like alien vibes, and I love it.
Okay. Yeah. I like it. I didn't expect you to say that.
Because it's weird, right? You wouldn't see, if you go to that egg photo, Tessa, you wouldn't see
Tessa to work.
You wouldn't see like hands coming out of the back of a table like this. So to me, the glucose goddess world is like a little UFO. It's I like saying it's the combination of like Einstein and Kim Kardashian. We're trying to make something just that hasn't been made before.
It feels to me like when I see movies and stuff, like almost like Mad Men visiting Paris, like that weird sort of psychedelic world, but it's like French and it's beautiful. And sciencey. It's right up my sister Kaya's alley. Shout out to her. She's a big fan of yours. What are some of the meals that you think, like when somebody's doing this hack number 3, week number 3, that they're implementing this, Are they doing it before every single meal?
1 meal a day.
1 meal a day.
So you pick whether you do it before your lunch or before your dinner. Some people find it easy to like prepare a veggie starter, bring it to work. Other people like to have a bit of time to cook before dinner the veggie starter. But again, there are some recipes in here. The first recipe in the week 3 veggie starter week is literally called Express Fiber. And it's just like grab some cherry tomatoes from your fridge and just eat them. So it runs the gamut. Some things are very simple, no cooking, nothing. And then I have my mom's slow cooked leeks as well, which is like a 30-minute long cooking process. So there's something for everyone, whether you want to spend 5-10 minutes cooking, whether you just want to have raw foods, whether you're cooking for a family and kids. I have lots of recipes that kids love, especially the yogurt radish recipe for the veggie starter week. Kids love that one. I got many messages from parents. So it's really for everybody. And as you can see here as well, this is the Savory breakfast week. The first recipe on here is just literally soft boiled eggs for 7 minutes in water. And you can do that the whole 4 weeks if you want.
Totally.
It can be very, very simple.
It can be very simple. The other thing that I like about a veggie starter that I've just seen in my own life when I've shared this tip with people and friends, when you are typically starting to get hungry again, especially if you're just starting to get in the rhythm of balancing your blood sugar out, and a lot of times people don't have that connection between how they feel and what their mind interprets it. Like, my wife has shared previously on her podcast before, she's really working on the idea of strengthening that interoception of like, hey, I'm hungry. Like I'm getting hungry. Let me like get ready for it. And sometimes people feel like I'm hungry now. Like all of a sudden they don't feel anything and they've been beyond hungry. Their blood sugar is dipped.
Yep.
And now when your blood sugar is dipped, you typically, even if you've been on a good sort of momentum, you're going to want what? You're going to want carbs. You're going to want that concentrated calories, those chips, that cookie, that something, even if you're in the process of making a meal. And I see this a lot. People are making a meal, they're getting ready for it. And just going to a simple veggie starter, it's one of the ways to get full and feel like you're matching that need for wanting energy.
Completely. And you can even eat the veggie starter as you're cooking. And Tessa, if you go to the yellow page, this is a testimonial that I'll read to you. After this first week, I'm eating with much less guilt and my body sends me sensations of physical hunger again. This makes me almost cry with emotion after a lot of years of a bad relationship with food. A lot of us, as you mentioned, like we're not really connected to our body. Alan Watts says the animal eats with his stomach and the man with his brain.
Yeah.
We don't eat with our body anymore. We're just like making these decisions based on the dopamine and whatever is around us. When you go through this method, the cool thing is you're actually reconnecting with yourself and your biology. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, you become a partner with your biology again. And that to me is the most beautiful place you can be because your body's just trying to keep you alive. Your body should be your best friend. But for many of us, that's not the case.
And I think there's also, going back to what we said before, people are getting a lot of mixed messages and they're trying to personalize it, right? So one of the things, we've had a lot of fasting experts on this podcast. And then even more recently, we've had a lot of experts that previously really talked about the benefits of fasting for a lot of people who are like now kind of pulling back a little bit and saying like, okay, yes, 14-hour window, 16-hour window, fine. But in general, especially for a lot of the younger audience that's listening, even the older audience, they're kind of really saying like, unless if you have some sort of medical reason that you're being guided down this pathway, so many people are just struggling with the basics. And if you're trying to hit that protein amount that you need in a day, right? Especially those 30 grams of protein for your first meal, which a lot of people recommend, and the total amount of protein that you're looking for in the day, along with the fat and the fiber that you talk about, and making sure that you also are eating full meals themselves, which is such a struggle. There's so many people that skip meals and then they overeat on the other side of things because they're on this glucose roller coaster. How do you think about fasting when people in your community ask you about it?
I think it's very individual, like do it if you want. We know from the science that, for example, eating 3 or 2 meals a day is better than eating like 6 meals a day.
Sure.
So that's sort of where I stand. I'm like, okay, avoid snacking. That's pretty clear that snacking is not great. But then if you want to fast a lot, if it works for you, that's fine. But don't forget that fasting is a stressor on the body. And so if you're layering fasting, sauna, cold showers, HIIT workout, stressful job, not a lot of sleep, that's a lot for the body to handle, especially a female body. So be mindful that fasting is something that is, it's a challenge. It's a good stress until it becomes overwhelming stress that your body can't handle anymore. I think most people do really well to say like, okay, I'm going to eat, 12 hours in the day and the rest of the time I'm not eating. So I'm going to eat between like 8 a.m., 8 p.m. and the rest not eat. Personally, when I'm working, I like having breakfast. It helps me. If I'm on vacation, I can easily skip it because I don't feel like there's other stuff going on. But to me, right now, I feel like eating breakfast is helpful.
I think, and this is just my own anecdotal thing, my wife, both my sisters, where a lot of the men that are friends in my life, I feel like, okay, this whole idea of like, okay, you're going to have your coffee in the morning, maybe a little bit of heavy cream or milk, sometimes people add to it, not a sugar bomb coffee. And then I see a lot of guys that like, okay, they do great. And then maybe they're going to eat at like 11, 12 and they're going to be fine, right? I find, just again, anecdotally speaking, not trying to make this about men or women, but just showing what I've seen in my life, I see that especially when there's a demanding day, the women in my life, that doesn't work for them. And I think it's okay to talk about that individuality. And I think one of the ways to do it is just try it. You know, if you've been fasting and not doing breakfast in the morning, try these hacks, have breakfast in the morning, make sure it's a savory breakfast and see how you feel and are set up for the
whatever
rest
time
of the day.
your first meal is, it needs to be savory. And so in the book, I explain, what if you don't eat breakfast? That's fine. Just make sure the first meal of your day is also savory. But yeah, I mean, it's very individual. And also I want to mention, you don't need to do intermittent fasting to be healthy.
Totally.
Like it's not a requisite. You really don't, because if you're doing intermittent fasting, but then when you're eating a lot of sugars and starches, that's not going to be helpful. So, don't minor in the majors. Like make sure that what you're eating is helping your body and then figure out when you want to eat it, I guess.
Yeah. Once people have put all these things together, right? Because I haven't had a chance to go through the full book yet and everything. I'm excited. I've ordered my copy, pre-ordered my copy. How is there a transition or an out period where you think about now, do you still layer those hacks in the same way? Do you play around a little bit and see which ones you want to keep? How do you help people transition out of this 4-week period into like, now it's a lifestyle?
So to me, the 4 weeks is almost like the on-ramp on the freeway. So at the end of the 4 weeks, you're doing 4 hacks a day. You're feeling amazing. And now it's up to you to figure out, now you have easy access to them. They're easy to do. So it's up to you to figure out which ones you want to keep doing every day. Usually the savory breakfast, people keep doing every day because it just transforms your life so much. Usually the veggie starter, people keep doing, especially as just a reminder to always start your meal with veggies. And then the vinegar and movement, people kind of have them in their toolbox and use them when they want. But it really depends on who you are. There's no rules. For me, these hacks are like, you have to create your own music with them. It's up to you. But at least after the 4 weeks, they're easy to do. You can do them. And then it's up to you to go about the rest of your life.
I love it. We mentioned it before and we showed that recipe of things that people can do after, right? Kind of like sprinkle it. What was that? That chocolate mousse?
The chocolate mousse, yeah, the
chocolate
dessert
mousse
recipe.
Are there other go-to tools that you found that like you can make a healthier version of it that you might want to highlight that are staples in your life?
You know what? I don't really like the concept of the healthier version of the dessert. Like all my desserts are actually with sugar. Yeah. It's like with the real stuff.
Talk about that.
Yeah. So I personally, and this is my philosophy, if I'm going to have ice cream, I'd rather have the really good ice cream I really like instead of like the keto sweetener version of ice cream that doesn't really hit the spot for me. Yeah. I mean, if that's what you're into, that's fine. Personally, like, if I'm going to have pasta, I'm going to have the real pasta. Yeah. If I'm going to have chocolate cake, I'm going to have the real chocolate cake. And then the rest of the time, I know I'm helping my body with the hacks anyway. So that's more of my philosophy and the glucose goddess approach. All the desserts in here, yes, they have protein, fat, and fiber in them. So they help reduce the spike. But they have real chocolate and real sugar and no sweeteners. It's the real deal.
Totally.
Yeah.
Enjoy it. Yeah. Savor it. Have fun with it. And I think the other thing too is that in this world of wellness industrial complex, right? If you look at a lot of these keto ice creams, which, great, like everybody's working on different things. Not that it's all calories in and out, but when you look at some of the calories that are there that have to be added in to sort of engineer this product to taste that way, some of the calories are a lot higher. And again, if somebody's focusing on body composition, if they're looking at a few different things, they're trying to dial it in, you could easily maybe overeat. Versus like some of the ones that are just straight, it's sweetened with like organic cane sugar or like regular sugar, God forbid, somebody having that and some like grass-fed whole milk or whatever it might be.
To me, when you're having dessert, it's a pleasure decision. this is not the moment where health happens. This is the moment when you optimize for your pleasure. The rest of the time when you're doing the hacks, that's when you optimize for your health. But if you want ice cream, like I order my favorite Van Leeuwen's triple chocolate fudge, extra chocolate sauce ice cream, like that's the one I want. And I know that this is a decision I'm making for my pleasure, not for my health. You see what I mean?
Do you find that when you or your community practices these things, either their frequency of wanting to seek out that other thing or the amount that they eat just naturally, without them even going for it, just naturally is not there at the level it was previously?
Absolutely. Because what happens when you study your glucose levels is that you go from a world in which you were controlled by your cravings, where any cookie at the office, anything at the supermarket that has sugar in it, you felt like, oh, I want to try that, into a world where you can pick your favorite ice cream or your favorite chocolate cake and you can say like, oh, I'm going to have that on Thursday when I go by the store. And you're fully in the pleasure world. You're not in the cravings being controlled by the sugar world. So you eat fewer things that are sweet, but you eat the stuff that you actually like.
Yeah.
And they don't kick off an addiction roller coaster and they don't make you feel guilty or ashamed or anything. And it's a world that I'd much rather live in.
In fact, I've kind of found myself, I eat dessert more frequently, but I literally just feel like, and I've never been a big sweet tooth, even though I know we all have it. I eat it, I get a little bit of the taste and I'm like, cool.
Nice.
Right?
Yeah.
I never used to really order dessert when we would go out, but I know that, in a way I have a little bit more metabolic flexibility. And I'm like, oh, you know what? Like, I'm just curious about that, blueberry cheesecake. And I just find that when I'm balanced in my life and not on that glucose roller coaster, it comes, I take a little bite and I'm like, okay, I get the idea. I get the point. I heard Mark Sisson say this one time at an event and he was like, yeah, okay, I see a chocolate cookie sometimes. I'm at an event, whatever. It's not the thing that I eat on a regular basis. I eat it, I chew it. I'm like, oh, wow, that was interesting. Or no, that wasn't like the best chocolate cookie that I had or whatever. I get the point. All right, cool. I'm going to move on with the rest of my life.
He's no longer controlled.
He's no longer controlled.
Yes.
Versus the idea of like, I have to have this now because this is the thing that I need.
Completely. I'm going to see if there's maybe a little testimonial about that. Oh, yeah. I used to have cravings between meals and I couldn't resist most of the time. Now I eat breakfast and don't think of food until lunchtime.
That's huge.
So that's a big shift that happens.
You picked 4 hacks and you turned it into this sort of 4-week methodology. Anybody can do it. It's in this new book, link in the show notes. People can try it out. Were there any fights for which ones would be the 4? Was there a 5th that was kind of competing a little bit? How did you decide out of all the hacks that were in the first book? Was it any aspect of community feedback? What was the biggest bang for the buck? What was easier to follow? How did you decide that these were the 4 hacks that we're going to say in?
Because they're the most powerful. And
you just intrinsically knew, or you had the data?
From the studies and from just the feedback from, working on this for 4 years now, it became very clear to me that these were the ones that people had the most trouble with in a way. Like it was harder for them to figure out how to get started, and B, the ones that are actually the most foundational and powerful. But, the other ones are also important. And I mentioned them in the book in the introduction. And once you've done this 4 weeks, adding those in is also helpful. But the savory breakfast, the vinegar, the veggie starter, the movements, they're really like the most important gentle giants to start with.
Those are the foundational.
Yeah, they really are.
What are some of the other ones that they could explore potentially? We did a whole episode on this and we'll link back to that. But what else could they play with a little bit once they've incorporated these?
So putting clothes on your carbs.
Right.
That's a fun one that people love. And it's sort of in subtitles throughout the book. Like, for example, in all the dessert recipes, all the carbs have clothing on them, which means you never see starches or sugars on their own. They're always combined with protein, fat, or fiber. In the first book, I talk also about sugars and sweeteners and which ones to pick. So that's something people like. I talk about snacking, which kind of snacks are best. I talk about calories. I talk about eating your food in the right order. So that's a hack that's even more advanced than the veggie starter. It asks you to do veggies first, then to do proteins and fats, then to do starches and sugars. Whereas in this method, really the most powerful part of that hack is just having that veggie starter. So I focused on that. You do the veggie starter and then you eat whatever you want for the rest of the meal in whatever order you want. But yeah, again, I chose these just because it's so clear that these are the ones you need to start with. They're the most powerful, the most important, the ones that give you the biggest bang for your buck, and the ones that people needed the most help and inspiration to get started with.
As somebody who's living in the public eye and has a lot of followers, and you're putting out your book and you've gotten a lot of great press, when your work goes out into the real world, you get a chance to see the impact that it's making in people's lives. And that was some of the testimonials we were, reading. And naturally, like all works, there's criticism that comes in as well. Has there been any helpful criticism or stress testing of any of the ideas or the way that they were presented in the first book that has made you refine or clarify how you talk about this whole world of glucose?
Yeah, I think, and not so much from the first book, but more so like in the first couple of years of my work on this topic, I got a lot of feedback because I read, all the DMs, all the comments, because my objective was to make something that people related to and liked. So I almost approached it like you would do like a product when you're building a software product, which is what I used to do in my previous job. Like you get user feedback and you just iterate. So some of the biggest sort of sources of feedback were from the type 1 diabetes community. So back in the day, I used to post like a lot of selfies of me with my glucose monitor on. And while some people who have type 1 diabetes thought it was great because it destigmatized the whole wearing it, other people from that community felt offended that, I would make it playful and fun when they depended on it for their life. So I stopped doing that. I stopped posting photos of me with the glucose monitor on. So that's one big thing that came out of it. And then a second thing was from some people, again, and it's never the whole community. It's like some people in a specific community. So other people in like the eating disorder recovery community have found that by applying sort of rules or hacks, that it's really difficult for them because it makes them go back into the disordered eating sort of mindset, and they may go too extreme. And I found a nice balance there because I feel like I totally understand, fad diets and things that ask you to do crazy things or restrict calories a lot or cut out entire food groups. That's not helpful, especially if you have a history of eating disorders. But I think it's really important for us to be able to put out these principles because people are dying, So we need some principles about how to eat because we're suffering so much from having completely lost touch with these very core, simple ideas of how to have breakfast, what to start your meals with. So I listened to a lot of that feedback and I tried to take the good parts of it. And I think I landed in a good place. And so my recommendation is, if you have a history of disordered eating and you feel triggered by, any sorts of rules around food, this is probably not for you, just because it asks you to do very specific things. But yeah, I think those were the two main sort of buckets of feedback. And I'm sure more will come and I'm super open to them. So always listening, always responding, because I just want to make sure I'm reducing harm. I really want to make sure that I'm making something that is as impactful and as good in reducing harm as I possibly can. Yeah. So always listening.
Totally. I think it's so important to listen. And also, to go back to your disclaimer that you were sharing, the other part of that too is that, then what is for you? If there's not going to be some principles, we live in a world that's so out of whack in terms of the availability of ultra processed foods and concentrated calories that are there. If there's not some sort of guidance, we can just look out in the world and we can see that the world is getting sicker and more unhealthy. So I love people that are trying their best to be inclusive to everybody that's around there, and still, you're navigating in such a beautiful way. And I think it's also sometimes just the honest conversation of like, okay, what's more important? And there's a whole group of people that might be just triggered by anything that's out there, but literally the world is dying.
Yeah. Some people just can't hear anything that has to do with food. Like as soon as you talk about food, that for them is a no-go, in which case, like clearly, any books or any content about food is not for them. So I think that's just a reality that a small group of people, that's their existence. But for everybody else, this is very important. This is really, really important. And I can't say, just because 5 people on Instagram are upset because I talk about food, I'm not going to do this anymore. Like I would never do that. I understand the balance of things.
Yeah, there's a greater community that you have a responsibility to that's actually being changed by your work.
Exactly. So yeah, no, but I agree with you. It's a difficult world to navigate, but I think as you go forward and you get more and more feedback from different kinds of people, you kind of understand like, whatever you do, somebody's going to be upset about it.
Of course.
Yeah.
It's a sign that you're making progress.
Yeah. The fact that my book cover has a pink on it, maybe some people are like, I hate pink. Pink is the worst. I'm like, okay, well, don't buy the book. You know, I mean, so as I've gotten deeper into this field and deeper into this work, I just greet these kinds of things with compassion and openness, but it doesn't really change my purpose because I think I've gotten so much feedback from thousands of people who've really enjoyed this work and given me amazing, constructive, wonderful feedback to make it better for them. That those are the people I'm serving, you know?
And when you've suffered, and it's just worthwhile here while we, are wrapping up this interview, it's worthwhile here to just touch on your story in case anybody missed it or forgot it from the first one. And also for anybody who's listening that's been in the same boat, is that when you've suffered and you've gone through really tough times, you would have given anything to feel better.
Yeah.
And so that also, in my experiences, when I have friends like yourself who are out there in the world putting themselves out there, and yes, people will criticize you, which is their fair right. Anybody can criticize anybody. People can debate. They can do all that stuff. We would hope that they would do it with civility, but sometimes people can't do it with civility and they're hurting. But there's a sense of having a little bit of armor around you because you have suffered. Talk to people a little bit about your story and kind of some of the suffering that you were going through before you stepped into this whole world.
So I had a childhood that was, full of Nutella crepes and orange juice, and I didn't really have any medical problems. Nobody in my family, had any medical issues. But then everything changed for me when I was 19. I had a freak accident. I jumped off a waterfall on a hike with friends, and one of my vertebrae exploded. So I broke my spine. From that moment started a month of horrible pain, very scary surgery. Now I have a lot of metal in my back, a really deep fear of death. Like I really was very scared of the surgery. And then when I woke up, again, lots of pain for a month, but physically I recovered quite well actually, because I was 19. So, your body kind of springs back, which was cool to see. But my mental health was completely destroyed. And I had never experienced any mental health issues up until I was 19. But in the months after my surgery and my recovery, I started getting depression, panic attacks, anxiety, depersonalization, which is when you feel like you're not in your body anymore and you look at your hands and they're just like, these are not mine. You look in the mirror and you have a panic attack because you're like, who's that? I mean, I was really not okay. And I felt so alone and I felt so confused about why this was happening to me. I didn't understand what my body was doing. I was like, why? What are you doing? What's going on? I was clueless. And my body became this black box that I couldn't understand. And it got really dark, but out of that darkness, this sort of thought kept coming back to me, which is, if you don't have your health, you have nothing. And I was broken. My health was gone. And so I realized, it doesn't matter what I'm studying. It doesn't matter what I'm doing. Like my health is broken. I need to fix it. And so I decided to, after my undergrad in math, which I completed in London, I moved on to study biochemistry in grad school because I needed to start understanding how my biology functioned, just so I could be okay. And across this whole thing, like I could never be alone, could never sleep in a house by myself at night, could barely take the bus by myself. Like I was really not okay, but I was sort of functioning and I didn't have the tools to heal yet. So I was just kind of going, about life, like trying to be okay and trying to find answers. So first in my studies, then I moved to California and worked in genetics for 5 years because I thought your DNA will, my DNA might help me understand what to do to feel good. Turns out your DNA is not that predictive. But while I was there, and I thank the universe for this, something happened, which is I had the opportunity to put on a glucose monitor for the first time, pretty randomly, just as part of a pilot study at the company I was working. And that totally changed my life again, because I started seeing that the days where I had glucose spikes, my mental health was worse. And one day I was even able to trigger one of the episodes of depersonalization with a really, really big glucose spike from like donuts for breakfast or something like that. And so I had finally, almost 8 years after my accident, I had finally found a clue. I was like, oh, maybe there's something that I can change here, or I can start understanding why these episodes are happening. So I became fascinated by glucose. I read all the papers, I looked at all the studies, I tried all these things on myself. I found that most of us have spikes from the scientific studies, and I found these hacks that I summarized from the science. And slowly, I felt like I was getting a little bit of power back, like a little bit of agency, a little bit of connection with myself. I was like, oh, look, if I keep my glucose level steady, like I do better than usual. And so that started a beautiful spring of healing for me. And again, I fixed my glucose. That was the first part. Then EMDR, emotional processing, like therapy, all these things I built on top of it. But that was the foundation. And I went from a place of being so lost, so confused, to where I am now, which is I actually feel amazing. And it makes me so happy. And I can, I'm staying here in LA for 2 weeks. I'm alone in a house for 2 weeks and I'm fine. And that's so cool, And every night I go to bed, I'm like, wow, we've come a long way. And so it makes me so happy to be on the other side.
You got your life back.
I got my life back. Yeah.
You got your life back.
Yeah.
It's an empowering message. And even, the thing about adversity is that most people listening, they don't have that story, but they have their own version of that story. Something they went through, right? Some either big T trauma or even a bunch of little T traumas that are in their life.
That ended up in that disconnection or that pain.
Ended up in that disconnection, ended up in some sort of pain, ended up in a place where even on a mild level where they feel like, a lot of people unfortunately feel like my body's working against me.
Yes. My body's fighting me. Why is my body doing this?
Why doesn't my body listen to me?
Yes.
Why is my body against me?
Well, you want to know what I think? I think a lot of the symptoms that we feel really angry about, like, why is my body doing this acne? Why is my body doing this hormonal thing? Actually, your body is trying to speak to you.
It's trying to send you a signal, a message.
We don't know how to listen. We get upset, right? But actually, if you think about it the other way, if you think, okay, what if these things happening to me are actually my body trying to communicate, being like, Drew, hello, there's a problem happening within. Like, help us solve the problem within. Once you flip it, you're like, oh, I'm sorry, body. Like, okay, yeah, let me try to fix you. Like, I didn't realize you were in so much pain, because your body's trying to keep you alive. Your body is not against you.
It's always for you, never against you.
It's always for you, yeah.
Yeah, even things like I shared a little bit about my story. Like I dealt with such bad acne when I was younger and all throughout high school. Literally, it's as if somebody had a little voodoo doll and said, let's give him acne. Like walked into school, first week, started acne all the way right up until, I left school. And when I left is actually, that road that I went down, I realized like I had a dairy, probably a sensitivity, but also it's probably related to, glucose looking back as well, or at least some element of it. And through removing dairy, commercialized processed dairy, which I probably had a sensitivity to because of just a ton of antibiotics as a kid, I even look back then and I'm like, man, like, is getting acne a way to show your tribe, your village, that something's going on inside of this person's body and they need help, right? Like something visual on the outside of like, I need help. And once I finally started to be able to listen to my body, see what worked for it, what didn't work for it, I was able to, stop having acne and listen and give my body exactly what it needed at that time. And I think a lot of that in our life, it's like a smoke detector, right? Yeah. It's letting us know these little signals. And can we be patient enough to listen and not try to fight against our body? And actually, it sounds corny, but love your body. Yeah. Love your body. Even so many people have come on this podcast and talk about, people notice the fat that starts around their waist as being one of the first thing that builds up when they get, they hit 30, 40, 50 and on. It's like, okay, this is your body's energy packet, right? This is how your body's storing energy. It's literally trying to look after you.
Yeah. And by the way, one of the reasons we gain fat on our body is because our body is putting excess glucose away to reduce the harm of it. So like in a way, your fat cells growing is a really good protective thing when it comes to glucose spikes. Totally. The more you're able to grow the number and size of your fat cells, the longer you're going to be protected against diabetes.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
There are different reasons why our skin ages. Just making simple changes in your diet can make a huge impact on how quickly your skin ages. And so starting really, if I had to start with one thing, I guess I would start with sugar.